Anything is possible. Novel by Elizabeth Strout. The Sign. Tommy Guptill had once owned a dairy farm, which he'd inherited from his father, and which was about 2 miles from the town of Amgash, Illinois. This was many years ago now, but at night Tommy still sometimes woke with the fear he had felt the night his dairy farm burned to the ground. The house had burned to the ground as well. The wind had sent sparks onto the house, which was not far from the barns. It had been his fault, he always thought. It was his fault because he had not checked that night on the milking machines to make sure they had been turned off properly, and this is where the fire started. Once it started, it ripped with a fury over the whole place. They lost everything, except for the brass frame to the living room mirror, which he came upon in the rubble the next day, and he left it where it was. A collection was taken up. For a number of weeks his kids went to school in the clothes of their classmates, until he could gather himself and the little money he had. He sold the land to the neighboring farmer, but it did not bring much money in. Then he and his wife, a short pretty woman named Shirley, bought new clothes, and he bought a house as well, Shirley keeping her spirits up admirably as all this was going on. They'd had to buy a house in Amgash, which was a run-down town, and his kids went to school there instead of in Carlisle, where they had been able to go to school before, his farm being just on the line dividing the two towns. Tommy took a job as the janitor in the Amgash school system. The steadiness of the job appealed to him, and he could never go to work on someone else's farm. He did not have the stomach for that. He was 35 years old at the time. The kids were grown now, with kids of their own who were also grown, and he and Shirley still lived in their small house. She had planted flowers around it, which was unusual in that town. Tommy had worried a good deal about his children at the time of the fire. They had gone from having their home be a place that class trips came to each year in spring. The 5th grade class from Carlisle would make a day of it, eating their lunches out beside the barns on the wooden tables there, then tromping through the barns watching the men milking the cows, the white foamy stuff going up and over them in the clear plastic pipes, to having to see their father as the man who pushed the broom over the magic dust that got tossed over the throw-up of some kid who had been sick in the hallways, Tommy wearing his gray pants and a white shirt that had Tommy stitched on it in red. Well, they had all lived through it. This morning Tommy drove slowly to the town of Carlisle for errands. It was a sunny Saturday in May, and his wife's 82nd birthday was just a few days away. All around him were open fields, the corn newly planted, and the soybeans too. A number of fields were still brown, as they'd been plowed under for their planting, but mostly there was the high blue sky, with a few white clouds scattered near the horizon. He drove past the sign on the road that led down to the Barton home. It still said sewing and alterations, even though the woman, Lydia Barton, who did the sewing and alterations had died many years ago. The Barton family had been outcasts, even in a town like Amgash. Their extreme poverty and strangeness making this so. The oldest child, a man named Pete, lived alone there. Now, the middle child was 2 towns away, and the youngest, Lucy Barton, had fled many years ago, and had ended up living in New York City. Tommy had spent time thinking of Lucy. All those years she had lingered after school, alone in a classroom, from 4th grade right up to her senior year in high school. It had taken her a few years to even look him in the eye. But now Tommy was driving past the area where his farm had been. These days it was all fields, not a sign of the farm was left, and he thought, as he often thought, about his life back then. It had been a good life, but he did not regret the things that had happened. It was not Tommy's nature to regret things, and on the night of the fire, in the midst of his galloping fear, he understood that all that mattered in this world were his wife and his children, and he thought that people lived their whole lives not knowing this as sharply and constantly as he did. Privately, he thought of the fire as a sign from God to keep this gift tightly to him. Privately, because he did not want to be thought of as a man who made up excuses for a tragedy, and he did not want anyone, not even his dearly beloved wife, to think he would do this. But he had felt that night, while his wife kept the children over by the road, he had rushed them from the house when he saw that the barn was on fire, as he watched the enormous flames flying into the nighttime sky, then heard the terrible screaming sounds of the cows as they died. He had felt many things, but it was just as the roof of his house crashed in, fell into the house itself, right into their bedrooms and the living room below, with all the photos of the children and his parents. As he saw this happen, he had felt undeniably what he could only think was the presence of God, and he understood why angels had always been portrayed as having wings. Because there had been a sensation of that, of a rushing sound, or not even a sound, and then it was as though God, who had no face, but was God, pressed up against him and conveyed to him without words, so briefly, so fleetingly, some message that Tommy understood to be, "It's all right, Tommy." And then Tommy had understood that it was all right. It was beyond his understanding, but it was all right. And it had been. He often thought that his children had become more compassionate as a result of having to go to school with kids who were poor, and not from homes like the one they had first known. He had felt the presence of God since, at times, as though a golden color was very near to him, but he never again felt visited by God as he had felt that night, and he knew too well what people would make of it, and this is why he would keep it to himself until his dying day, the sign from God. Still, on a spring morning as this one was, the smell of the soil brought back to him the smells of the cows, the moisture of their nostrils, the warmth of their bellies. And his barns, he had had 2 barns, and he let his mind roll over pieces of scenes that came to him. Perhaps because he had just passed the Barton place, he thought of the man, Ken Barton, who had been the father of those poor, sad children, and who had worked on and off for Tommy, and then he thought, as he more often did, of Lucy, who had left for college and then ended up in New York City. She had become a writer. Lucy Barton. Driving, Tommy shook his head slightly. Tommy knew many things as a result of being the janitor in that school. More than 30 years, he knew of girls' pregnancies and drunken mothers and cheating spouses, for he overheard these things talked about by the students in their small huddles by the bathrooms, or near the cafeteria. In many ways he was invisible, he understood that. But Lucy Barton had troubled him the most. She and her sister, Vicky, and her brother, Pete, had been viciously scorned by the other kids, and by some of the teachers too. Yet, because Lucy stayed after school so often for so many years, he felt, though she seldom spoke, that he knew her the best. One time when she was in the 4th grade, it was his first year working there, he had opened a door to a classroom and found her lying on 3 chairs, pushed together, over near the radiators, her coat as a blanket, fast asleep. He had stared at her, watching her chest move slightly up and down, seen the dark circles beneath her eyes, her eyelashes spread like tiny twinkling stars, for her eyelids had been moist as though she had been weeping before she slept, and then he backed out. Slowly, quietly as he could, it had felt almost unseemly to come upon her like that. But one time he remembered this. Now she must have been in junior high school, and he'd walked into the classroom and she was drawing on the blackboard with chalk. She stopped as soon as he stepped inside the room. "You go ahead," he said. On the board was a drawing of a vine with many small leaves. Lucy moved away from the blackboard, then she suddenly spoke to him. "I broke the chalk," she said. Tommy told her that was fine. "I did it on purpose," she said, and there was a tiny glint of a smile before she looked away. "On purpose?" he asked, and she nodded, again with the tiny smile. So he went and picked up a piece of chalk, a full stick of it, and he snapped it in half and winked at her. In his memory she had almost giggled. "You drew that?" he asked, pointing to the vine with the small leaves. And she shrugged then and turned away. But usually, she was just sitting at a desk and reading, or doing her homework. He could see that she was doing that. He pulled up to a stop sign now, and said the words aloud to himself quietly, "Lucy, Lucy, Lucy B. Where did you go to? How did you flee?" He knew how. In the spring of her senior year, he had seen her in the hallway after school, and she had said to him, so suddenly open-faced, her eyes big, "Mr. Guptill, I'm going to college." And he had said, "Oh, Lucy. That's wonderful." She had thrown her arms around him, she would not let go, and so he hugged her back. He always remembered that hug, because she had been so thin, he could feel her bones and her small breasts, and because he wondered later how little that girl had ever been hugged. Tommy pulled away from the stop sign and drove into the town. Right there beyond was a parking space. Tommy pulled into it, got out of his car, and squinted in the sunshine. "Tommy Guptill," shouted a man, and turning, Tommy saw Griff Johnson walking toward him. With his characteristic limp, for Griff had one leg that was shorter than the other, and even his built-up shoe could not keep him from limping. Griff had an arm out, ready to shake hands. "Griffith," said Tommy, and they pumped their arms for a long time, while cars drove slowly past them down Main Street. Griff was the insurance man here in town, and he had been awfully good to Tommy, learning that Tommy had not insured his farm for its worth. Griff had said, "I met you too late." Which was true. But Griff, with his warm face and big belly now, continued to be good to Tommy. In fact, Tommy did not know anyone he thought who was not good to him. As a breeze moved around them, they spoke of their children and grandchildren. Griff had a grandson who was on drugs, which Tommy thought was very sad. And he just listened and nodded, glancing up at the trees that lined Main Street, their leaves so young and bright green. And then he listened about another grandson who was in medical school now, and Tommy said, "Hey, that's just great, good for him," and they clapped hands on each other's shoulders and moved on. In the dress shop, with its bell that announced his entrance, was Marilyn Macaulay, trying on a dress. Tommy, What brings you in here? Marilyn was thinking of getting the dress for her granddaughter's baptism a few Sundays from now, she said, and she tugged on the side of it. It was beige with swirling red roses. She was without her shoes, standing in just her stockings. She said that it was an extravagance to buy a new dress for such a thing, but that she felt like it. Tommy, who had known Marilyn for years, first when she was in high school as a student in Amgash, saw her embarrassment. And he said he didn't think it was an extravagance at all. Then he said, when you have a chance, Marilyn, can you help me find something for my wife? He saw her become efficient then, and she said yes, she certainly would, and she went into the changing room and came back out in her regular clothes, a black skirt and a blue sweater, with her flat black shoes on, and right away she took Tommy over to the scarves. Here, she said, pulling out a red scarf that had a design with gold threads running through it. Tommy held it, but picked up a flowery scarf with his other hand. Maybe this, he said. And Marilyn said, yes, that looks like Shirley, and then Tommy understood that Marilyn liked the red scarf herself but would never allow herself to buy it. Marilyn. That first year Tommy worked as a janitor, had been a lovely girl, saying hi, Mr. Guptill, whenever she saw him, and now she had become an older woman, nervous, thin, her face pinched. Tommy thought what other people thought, it was because her husband had been in Vietnam and had never afterward been the same. Tommy would see Charlie Macaulay around town, and he always looked so far away, the poor man, and poor Marilyn too. So Tommy held the red scarf with the gold threads for a minute as though considering it, then said, I think you're right, this one looks more like Shirley. And took the flowery one to the register. He thanked Marilyn for her help. I think she'll love it, Marilyn said, and Tommy said he was sure she would. Back on the sidewalk, Tommy walked up to the bookstore. He thought there might be a gardening book his wife would like. Once he was inside, he walked about. Then saw right there in the middle of the store a display of a new Lucy Barton book. He picked it up. It had on its cover a city building. Then he looked at the back flap, where her picture was. He thought he wouldn't recognize her if he met her now. It was only because he knew it was her that he could see the remnants of her in her smile, still a shy smile. He was reminded once again of the afternoon she said she had broken the chalk on purpose, her funny little smile that day. She was an older woman now, and the photo showed her hair pulled back. And the more he looked at it, the more he could see the girl she had been. Tommy moved out of the way of a mother with two small children. She moved past him with the kids and said, "'Excuse me, sorry," and he said, "Oh sure," and then he wondered, as he sometimes did, what Lucy's life had been like, so far away in the city of New York. He put the book back on the display and went to find the sales clerk to ask about a book on gardening. "I might have just the thing, we just got this in," and the girl, who was not a girl, really, except they all seemed like girls to Tommy these days, brought him a book with hyacinths on the cover, and he said, "Oh, that's perfect." The girl asked if he wanted it wrapped, and he said yes, that would be great, and he watched while she spread the silver paper around it, with her fingernails that were painted blue, and with her tongue sticking slightly out between her teeth. As she concentrated, she put the Scotch tape on, then gave him a big smile when it was done. "That's perfect," he repeated, and she said, "You have a nice day now," and he told her the same. He left the store and walked across the street in the bright sunshine. He would tell Shirley about Lucy's book. She had loved Lucy because he had. Then he started the car and pulled out of the parking space, started back down the road toward home. The Johnson boy came to Tommy's mind, how he couldn't get off drugs, and then Tommy thought of Marilyn McCauley and her husband, Charlie, and then his mind went to his older brother, who had died a few years back, and he thought how his brother, who had been in World War II, who had been at the camps when they were being emptied, he thought how his brother had returned from the war a different man, his marriage ended, his children disliked him. Not long before his brother died, he told Tommy about what he had seen in the camps, and how he and the others had the job of taking the townspeople through them. They had somehow taken a group of women from the town through the camps to show them what had been right there, and Tommy's brother said that although some of the women wept, some of them put their chins up, and looked angry, as if they refused to be made to feel bad. This image had always stayed with Tommy, and he wondered why it came to him now. He unrolled the window all the way down. It seemed the older he grew, and he had grown old, the more he understood that he could not understand this confusing contest between good and evil, and that maybe people were not meant to understand things here on earth. But as he approached the sign that declared sewing and alterations, he slowed his car and turned down the long road that led to the Barton house. Tommy had made a practice of checking in on Pete Barton, who, of course, was not a kid now but an older man, ever since Ken, Pete's father, had died. Pete had stayed living in the house alone, and Tommy had not seen him for a couple of months. Down the long road he drove, it was isolated out here. A thing he and Shirley had discussed over the years. Isolation not being a good thing for the kids. There were cornfields on one side and soybean fields on the other. The single tree huge that had been in the middle of the cornfields had been struck by lightning a few years back, and it lay now on its side, the long branches bare and broken and poking up toward the sky. The truck was there next to the small house, which had not been painted in so many years it looked washed out. The shingles pale, some missing. The blinds were drawn, as they always were, and Tommy got out of his car and went and knocked on the door. Standing in the sunshine, he thought again of Lucy Barton, how she had been a skinny child, painfully so, and her hair was long and blonde, and almost never did she look him in the eye. Once, when she was still so young, he had walked into a classroom after school and found her sitting there, reading, and she had jumped. He saw her really jump with fear when the door opened. He had said to her quickly, "No, no, you're fine." But it was that day, seeing the way she jumped, seeing the terror that crossed her face, when he guessed that she must have been beaten at home. She would have to have been, in order to be so scared at the opening of a door. After he realized this, he took more notice of her, and there were days he saw what seemed to be a bruise, yellow or bluish, on her neck or her arms. He told his wife about it, and Shirley said, "What should we do, Tommy?" And he thought about it, and she thought about it, and they decided they would do nothing. But the day they discussed this was the day Tommy told his wife what he had seen Ken Barton, Lucy's father, do, years before, when Tommy had his dairy farm and Ken worked on the machinery at times. Tommy had walked out behind one of the barns and seen Ken Barton with his pants down by his ankles, pulling on himself, swearing what a thing to have come upon. Tommy said, "None of that out here, Ken," and the man turned around and got into his truck and drove off, and he did not return to work for a week. "Tommy, why didn't you tell me this?" Shirley's blue eyes looked up at him with horror. And Tommy said it seemed too awful to repeat. "Tommy, we need to do something," his wife said that day. And they talked about it more, and decided once again there was nothing they could do. The blind moved slightly, and then the door opened, and Pete Barton stood there. "Hello, Tommy," he said. Pete stepped outside into the sunshine, closing the door behind him, and stood next to Tommy, and Tommy understood that Pete didn't want him inside the house. Already a rank odor came to Tommy, maybe coming off Pete himself. "Just driving by, and I thought I'd see how you were doing." Tommy said this casually. "Thanks, I'm okay. Thank you." In the bright sun, Pete's face looked pale, and his hair was almost all gray now, but it was a pale gray, and it seemed to match the pale shingles of the house he stood in front of. "You're working over at the Dar place?" Tommy asked. Pete said he was, though that job was almost done, but he had another lined up in Hanston. "Good." Tommy squinted toward the horizon, all soybean fields in front of him, the bright green of them showing in the brown soil. Right on the horizon was the barn of the Pedersen place. They spoke of different machines then, and also of the wind turbines that had been put up recently between Carlisle and Hanston. "We've just got to get used to them, I guess," said Tommy. And Pete said he guessed Tommy was right about that. The one tree that stood next to the driveway had its little leaves out, and the branches dipped for a moment in the wind. Pete leaned against Tommy's car, his arms folded across his chest. He was a tall man, but his chest seemed almost concave, he was that thin. "Were you in the war, Tommy?" Tommy was surprised at the question. "No," he said. "No, I was too young, just missed it. My older brother was, though." Up and down quickly, once, went the branches of the tree, as though it had felt a breeze that Tommy had not. "Where was he?" Tommy hesitated. Then he said, he was assigned to the camps. At the end of the war, he was in the corps that went to the camps in Buchenwald. Tommy looked up at the sky, reached into his pocket, pulled out his sunglasses and slipped them onto his face. He was changed after that. I can't say how, but he was changed. He walked over and leaned against his car, next to Pete. After a moment, Pete Barton turned toward Tommy. In a voice without belligerence, even with a touch of apology to it, he said, "Look, Tommy. I'd like it if you didn't keep coming over here." Pete's lips were pale and cracked, and he wet them with his tongue, looking at the ground. For a moment Tommy was not sure he heard right, but as he started to say "I only," Pete looked at him fleetingly and said, "You do it to torture me, and I think enough time has gone by now." Tommy pushed himself away from the car and stood straight, looking through his sunglasses at Pete. "Torture you?" Tommy asked. "Pete, I'm not here to torture you." A sudden small gust of wind blew up the road then, and the dirt they stood on swirled a tiny bit. Tommy took his sunglasses off so that Pete could see his eyes. He looked at him with great concern. "Forget I said that, I'm sorry." Pete's head ducked down. "I just like to check on you every so often," Tommy said. "You know, neighbor to neighbor. You live here all alone. Seems to me a neighbor should check in once in a while." Pete looked at Tommy with a wry smile and said, "Well, you're the only man who ever does that. Or woman." Pete laughed. It was an uncomfortable sound. They stood, the two of them, Tommy's arms unfolded. Now, he slipped his hands into his pockets, and Pete slipped his hands into his pockets as well. Pete kicked at a stone, then turned to look out over the field. "The Pedersons should take that tree away, I don't know why they don't. It was one thing to plow around it when it was standing up straight, but now, sheesh. They're going to, I heard them talking." Tommy did not quite know what to do, and this was an odd feeling for him. Still looking toward the toppled tree, Pete said, "My father was in the war. He got all screwed up." Now Pete turned and looked at Tommy, his eyes squinting in the sunshine. "When he was dying he told me about it. It was terrible what happened to him, and then he shot these two German guys. He knew they weren't soldiers. They were almost kids, but he told me he felt every day of his life that he should have killed himself in return." Tommy listened to this, looking at the boy, the man without his sunglasses, which he held in his hand in his pocket. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know your father was in the war." "My father," and here Pete unmistakably had tears in his eyes. "My father was a decent man, Tommy." Tommy nodded slowly. "He did things because he couldn't control himself. And so Pete turned away. In a moment he turned partway back to Tommy and said, "And so he went in and turned on those milking machines that night, and then the place burned down, and I never, ever forgot it. Tommy, it was like I knew he had done it. And I know you know that too." Tommy felt his scalp break out into goosebumps. It continued, he felt the bumps crawling across his head. The sun seemed very bright, and yet it seemed it shone in a cone around only him. In a moment he said, "Son," the word came out involuntarily. "You mustn't think that." "Look," Pete said, and his face had some color to it. Now he knew the milking machines could cause trouble. He'd talked about it. He'd said it wasn't a very sophisticated system and they could get overheated in a hurry. Tommy said, "He was right about that. He was mad at you. He was always mad at someone. But he was mad at you. I don't know what happened, but he was working at your place, and then he stopped. I think he went back eventually, but he never liked you. After whatever happened had happened." Tommy put his sunglasses back on. He said with deliberateness, "I found him playing with himself, Pete. Pulling on himself, behind the barns, and I said that was something he couldn't do there. Oh, man." Pete wiped at his nose. "Oh, man." He looked up at the sky. Then he looked at Tommy quickly and said, "Well, he didn't like you. And the night before the fire, he went out. Sometimes he would just do that. Go out. He wasn't a drinker, but sometimes he'd just leave the house and go out, and that night he went out and he got back around midnight, I remember, because my sister couldn't sleep, she was too cold, and my mother here." Pete stopped, as though to catch his breath. "Well, my mother was up with her, and I remember she said, 'Lucy, go to sleep, it's midnight.' And my father came home. And the next morning when I was at school, well, We all heard about the fire. And I just knew. Tommy steadied himself against the car. He said, "Nothing." "And you knew too," Pete finally said. "And that's why you stopped by here, to torture me." For many moments, the two men stood there. The breeze had picked up and Tommy felt it ripple the sleeves of his shirt. Then Pete turned to go back inside the house. The door opened with a squeak. "Pete!" Tommy called. "Pete, listen to me. I don't come here to torture you. And I still don't know even with what you just told me that it's true." Pete turned back. After a moment he closed the door behind him and walked back to Tommy. His eyes were moist, either from the wind that was whipping up or from tears. Tommy didn't know. Pete spoke almost tiredly. "I'm just telling you, Tommy. He wasn't supposed to go and do those things in the war that he had to do. People aren't supposed to murder people. And he did, and he did awful things, and awful things happened to him, and he couldn't live inside himself. Tommy. That's what I'm trying to say. Other men could do it, but he couldn't. It ruined him. And what about your mother?" Tommy asked suddenly. Pete's face changed. A blankness of expression came to it. "What about her?" he asked. "How did she take all this?" Pete seemed defeated by this question. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know what my mother was like. I never really knew her myself," Tommy said. "Just saw her out and about once in a while." But it came to him now, he had never seen the woman smile. Pete was gazing at the ground. He shrugged and said, "I don't know about my mother." Tommy's mind, which had been spinning, rearranged itself. He felt himself again. "Now listen, Pete. I'm glad you told me about your father being in the war. I heard what you said. You said he was a decent man, and I believe you. But he was." Pete almost wailed this, looking at Tommy with his pale eyes. "Whenever he did something, he felt terrible about it later, and after your fire he was so agitated, Tommy, for weeks and weeks he was worse than ever." "It's okay, Pete. But it's not." "But it is." Tommy said this firmly. He walked over to the man and put his hand on Pete's arm for a moment. Then he added, "And I don't think he did it, anyway. I think I forgot to turn the machines off that night, and your father was mad at me, and he probably felt bad about what happened. He never told you he did it, am I right? When he was dying, and told you about killing those men in the war, he never confessed to burning my barns down. Did he?" Pete shook his head. "Then I suggest you let it go, Pete. You've had enough to contend with." Pete ran a hand over his hair. A piece of it stood up. Briefly, with some confusion, he said, "Contend with? I saw how you were treated by the town, Pete. And your sisters, too. I saw that when I was a janitor." Tommy felt slightly winded. Pete gave a small shrug. He still seemed vaguely confused. "Okay," he said. "Okay, then." They stood a few more moments in the breeze and then Tommy said he was going to get going. "Hold on," said Pete. "Let me drive down the road with you. It's time I got rid of that sign of my mother's. I've been meaning to do that, and I'll do it now." "Hold on," he said again. Tommy waited by the car while Pete went inside the house, and very soon Pete came back out, holding a sledgehammer. Tommy got in the driver's seat, and Pete got in on the passenger's side, and together they drove down the road. The rank odor Tommy had smelled before was stronger now with the man next to him. As he drove, Tommy suddenly remembered how one time he had put a quarter near the desk where Lucy would sit when she was in junior high school. She always went to Mr. Haley's room. The man taught social studies for a year, then went into the service, but he must have been kind to Lucy because that was the room, even when it later became the science room, that Lucy preferred to be in. And so one day Tommy left a quarter near the desk he knew she sat at. The school had just gotten a vending machine and there were ice cream sandwiches you could buy for a quarter, so he left the quarter there where Lucy could see it. That night, after she had gone home, Tommy went into the room and the quarter was still there, exactly where he had left it. He almost asked Pete, then, about Lucy, if they were in touch, but he had already pulled up next to the sign that said sewing and alterations, and so he just said, "Here you go, Pete. You be well." And Pete thanked him and got out of the car. After a few moments, Tommy glanced in his rear view mirror, and what he saw was Pete Barton hitting the sign with the sledgehammer. Something about the way he hit it, the force, made Tommy watch carefully as he drove down the road. He saw the man hit the sign again and again with what seemed to be increasing force. And as Tommy's car dipped down just slightly, losing sight for a moment, he thought, wait. And when his car came back up, he looked again in the rearview mirror and he saw again this man hitting that sign with rage. With a ferocity that astonished Tommy. It was astonishing, the rage with which that man was hitting that sign. It seemed indecent to Tommy that he was witnessing it, for it felt as private in its anguish as what the boy's father had been doing out behind Tommy's barns that day. And then as Tommy drove he realized, oh, it was the mother. It was the mother. She must have been the really dangerous one. He slowed the car, then turned it around. As he drove back, he saw that Pete had stopped smashing the sign and was now kicking at the pieces with a tired dejection. Pete looked up, surprise showing on his face, as Tommy approached. Tommy leaned to unroll the passenger's window and said, "Pete, get in." The man hesitated, sweat on his face now. "Get in," Tommy said again. Pete got back into the car and Tommy drove down the road, back to the Barton home. He turned the car engine off. "Pete, I want you to listen to me very, very carefully." A look of fear passed over Pete's face, and Tommy put his hand briefly on the man's knee. It was the look of terror that had passed over Lucy's face when he surprised her in the classroom. "I want to tell you something I had never in my life planned on telling anyone. But on the night of the fire," and Tommy told him then, in detail, how he had felt God come to him, and how God had let Tommy know it was all okay. When he was done, Pete, who had listened intently, sometimes looking down, sometimes looking at Tommy, now looked at Tommy with wonder on his face. "So you believe that?" Pete asked. "I don't believe it," Tommy said. "I know it. And you never even told your wife." "I never did, no." "But why not?" "I guess there are some things in life we don't tell others." Pete looked down at his hands, and Tommy looked at the man's hands as well. He was surprised by them. They were strong-fingered, large, they were a grown man's hands. So you're saying my father was doing God's work? Pete shook his head slowly. No, I'm telling you what happened to me that night. I know. I hear what you're telling me. Pete gazed through the windshield. I just don't know what to make of it. Tommy looked at the truck that sat next to the house. Its fender glinted in the sunlight. The truck was old and gray-brown. It almost matched the color of the house. It seemed to Tommy that he sat there for many minutes, looking at that truck and how it matched the house. Tell me how Lucy is, said Tommy then, moving his feet, hearing them scrape over the grit on the floor of the car. I saw she's got a new book. She's good, said Pete, and his face lit up. She's good. And it's a good book. She sent me an early copy. I'm really proud of her. Tommy said, you know, she wouldn't even take a quarter I left her once, and he told Pete about leaving the quarter and finding it later. No, Lucy wouldn't have taken a penny that wasn't hers, Pete said. He added, my sister Vicky, well, she's another story. I bet she would have taken the quarter and then asked for more. He glanced at Tommy. Yeah. She'd have taken it? Well, I guess there's always that struggle between what to do and what not to do, Tommy said, attempting to be jocular. Pete said, what? And Tommy repeated it. That's interesting, said Pete, and Tommy was struck with a sense of being with a child, not a grown man, and he looked again at Pete's hands. The car engine made a few clicking sounds as they sat in silence. You asked about my mother, Pete said after a few moments. Nobody has ever asked me about my mother. But the truth is, I don't know if my mother loved us or not. I don't know about her in some big way. He looked at Tommy, and Tommy nodded. But my father loved us, Pete said. I know he did. He was troubled, oh man, was he troubled. But he loved us. Tommy nodded his head again. Tell me more about what you just said, Pete asked. About what? What was I just saying? The struggle, did you say that? Between doing what we should and what we shouldn't do. Oh. Tommy looked through the windshield at the house sitting so silently and so worn out there in the sunshine, its blinds drawn like tired eyelids. Well, here's an example on a large scale. And then Tommy told Pete about what his brother had seen in the war, the women who had walked through the camps, how some had wept, and others had looked furious and would not be made to feel bad. And so there's a struggle, or a contest, I guess you could say, all the time, it seems to me. And remorse. Well, to be able to show remorse, to be able to be sorry about what we've done that's hurt other people, that keeps us human. Tommy put his hand on the steering wheel. That's what I think, he said. My father showed remorse. He's what you're talking about, in one person. The contest. I suppose you're right. The sun had grown so high in the sky it could not be seen from the car. I never have talks like this, said Pete, and Tommy was struck once again by how young this boy man seemed. Tommy experienced a tiny physical pain deep in his chest that seemed directly connected to Pete. I'm an old man, said Tommy. I think if we're going to have talks like this one, I should stop by more often. How about I see you 2 Saturdays from now? Tommy was surprised to see Pete's hands become fists that he banged down on his knees. No, Pete said. No. You don't have to. No. "I want to," said Tommy, and he thought then he knew as he said this that it was not true. But did that matter? It didn't matter. I don't need someone coming to see me out of obligation. Pete said this quietly. The pain deep in Tommy's chest increased. I don't blame you for that, he said. They sat together in the car, which was now warm, and the smell, to Tommy, was palpable. In a moment Pete spoke again. Well, I guess I thought you were coming here to torture me, and I was wrong about that. So I guess maybe I'd be wrong to think you were just obliging me. I think you'd be wrong, said Tommy. But he was aware, again, that this was not true. The truth was that he did not really want to visit this poor boy man seated next to him ever again. They sat in silence for a few moments more, then Pete turned to Tommy, gave him a nod. All right, I'll see you then, said Pete, getting out of the car. Thanks, Tommy, he said, and Tommy said, thank you. Driving home, Tommy was aware of a sensation like that. Of a tire becoming flat, as though he had been filled all his life with some sustaining air, and it was gone now. He felt, increasingly as he drove, a sense of fear. He could not understand it, but he had told what he had vowed to himself never to tell, that God had come to him the night of the fire. Why had he told? Because he wanted to give something to that poor boy who had been smashing the sign of his mother so ferociously. Why did it matter that he had told the boy? Tommy wasn't sure. But Tommy felt he had pulled the plug on himself, that by telling the thing he would never tell he had diminished himself past forgiveness. It really frightened him. So you believe that, Pete Barton had said. He felt no longer himself. He said, quietly, God, what have I done? And he meant that he was really asking God. And then he said, where are you, God? But the car remained the same. Warm, still slightly smelling from the presence of Pete Barton, just rumbling over the road. He drove more quickly than he usually did. Going past him were the fields of soybeans and corn and the brown fields as well, and he saw them only barely. At home, Shirley was sitting on the front steps, her glasses twinkled in the sunlight, and she waved to him as he drove up the small driveway. Shirley, he called as he got out of the car. Shirley. She pulled herself up from the steps by holding onto the railing, and came to him with worry on her face. Shirley, he said, I have to tell you about something. At the small kitchen table, in their small kitchen, they sat. A tall water glass held peony buds, and Shirley pushed it to the side. Tommy told her then what had just happened that morning at the Barton home, and she kept shaking her head, pushing her glasses up her nose with the back of her hand. Oh, Tommy, she said. Oh, that poor boy. But here's the thing, Shirley. It's more than that. There's something else I need to tell you. And so Tommy looked at his wife, her blue eyes behind her glasses, a faded blue these days, but with the tiny shiny parts from her cataract surgery, and he told her then, with the same detail he had told Pete Barton, how he had felt God come to him the night of the fire. But now I think I must have imagined it, Tommy said. It couldn't have happened, I made it up. He opened both his hands upward, shook his head. His wife watched him for a moment. He saw her watching him, saw her eyes get a little bit bigger, then begin to break into a tenderness around their corners. She leaned forward, took his hand, and said, "But, Tommy, why couldn't it have happened? Why couldn't it have been just what you thought it was that night?" And then Tommy understood, that what he had kept from her their whole lives was, in fact, easily acceptable to her, and what he would keep from her now his doubt. His sudden belief that God had never come to him, was a new secret replacing the first. He took his hand from hers. "You might be right," he said. "A paltry thing," he added, "but it was true," he said, "I love you, Shirley." And then he looked at the ceiling. He could not look at her for a moment or two. Windmills. A few years ago, with morning sunlight coming into her bedroom, Patty nicely had had the television on, and the sunlight had caused whatever was on the screen to be unseen from certain angles. Patty's husband, Sebastian, was still alive then, and she was getting herself ready for work. Earlier, she had been making sure that he was set for the day. His illness had only begun back then, and she was not sure, they were not sure what the final outcome would be. On the television was the usual morning show, and Patty watched intermittently as she moved about the bedroom. She was sticking a pearl earring into her earlobe when she heard the woman announcer saying, "Lucy Barton will be with us after the break." Patty walked toward the television and squinted, and in a few minutes Lucy Barton, who had written a novel, came on, and Patty said, "Oh my gosh." She went to the bedroom door and called, "Sibby." Sebastian came into the bedroom then, and Patty said, "Oh, honey, oh, Sibby." She helped him into bed, and smoothed his forehead. The reason she remembered this now, the fact that Lucy Barton had been on television, was because she had then told Sebastian about the woman. Lucy Barton had grown up terribly poor, right nearby in Omgash, Illinois. I didn't know them, since I was in school in Hanston, but they were the kids that people would say, "Oh, cooties," and run away from, she explained to her husband. Here was why Patty knew this. Lucy's mother had made dresses, and Patty's mother had used her as a seamstress. A few times, Patty's mother had taken Patty and her sisters to Lucy Barton's home. The place the Bartons lived in was tiny, and it smelled. But here was Lucy Barton. Why, she had become a writer, and was living in New York City. Patty said, "Look, honey, she looks nice." Sebastian had become interested. She saw his keenness as he listened to the story. In a few minutes he asked some questions. For example, had Lucy seemed different from her brother and sister? Patty said she didn't know. She hadn't known any of them, really. But here was something odd. Lucy's parents had been asked to the wedding of Patty's oldest sister, Linda, and Patty had never figured that out. She couldn't imagine Lucy's father had even owned a suit. Why would they have been at her sister's wedding? Sebastian said, "Maybe your mother didn't have anyone else who would talk to her at that point," and Patty realized he was exactly right. Patty's face had turned bright red as she saw the truth to this. "Sweetheart," said Sebastian, and reached for her hand. A few months later Sebastian was gone. Having met in their late 30s, they'd had only 8 years together. No children. Patty had never known a better man. Today she drove with her car's air conditioner turned on high. Her extra weight made Patty get hot easily, and it was already late May and the weather was lovely. Everyone kept saying that the weather was lovely, but for Patty that meant it was really too warm. She drove by A field where the corn was just inches high, and by a field of soybeans bright green and close to the ground. Then she drove through the town, winding her way around a street where some of the houses had explosions of peonies by their porches. Patty loved peonies. And then to the school where she was a high school guidance counselor. She parked, checked her lipstick in the rear-view mirror, gave her hair a bounce with her hand, then heaved herself from the car. Across the parking lot was Angelina Mumford getting out of her own car. She was a middle school social studies teacher, and her husband had recently left her. Patty gave a big wave, and Angelina waved back. In Patty's office were many folders, and also a cluster of small framed photographs of her nieces and nephews. And there were pamphlets from colleges, all in an array, on top of her filing cabinet and on her desk. And there was her scheduling book on her desk too. Lila Lane had missed her appointment from the day before. There was a knock on the door, which was open, and a tall, pretty girl stood there. "Come in," Patty said. Lila unease came into the room with the girl. She slouched in her chair, and the glance she gave Patty made Patty frightened. The girl's hair was long and blonde, and as she reached to pull it up and across one shoulder, Patty saw the tattoos like a small barbed wire fence that went across the girl's wrist. Patty said, "That's a nice name. Lila Lane." The girl said, "I was supposed to be named for my aunt, but at the last minute my mom said, fuck her." Patty took the papers and bounced their edges against her desk. The girl sat up straight, and spoke with suddenness. "She's a bitch. She thinks she's better than any of us. I never even met her." "You never met your aunt?" "Nope. She came back here when her father died, my mother's father, and then she went away and I've never met her. She lives in New York and she thinks her shit doesn't stink." "Well, let's look at your scores here. These are pretty good scores." Patty never liked her students to speak roughly. She found it disrespectful. She looked over at the girl, then back at the papers. "Your grades are good, too," Patty added. "I skipped third grade." The girl said this with a tone of belligerence, but Patty thought she heard the pride beneath it. Patty said, "Good for you. Well, then, I guess you were always a good student. They don't let you skip a grade for nothing." She raised her eyebrows pleasantly at the girl. But Lila was looking around Patty's office, studying the pamphlets, the photos of Patty's nieces and nephews. And then finally she looked for a long moment at the poster on the wall that had a kitten swinging from a branch with the block letters hang in there below. The kitten. Lila looked back at Patty. "What?" she said. "I said, they don't let you skip a grade for nothing," Patty repeated. "Of course they don't. Geez Louise." The girl moved her long legs so that they went in the other direction, but she stayed slouching. "Okay." Patty nodded. "So what about your future? You have good grades, good scores. Are these your kids?" The girl was squinting, and she pointed laconically at the photos. "Those are my nieces and nephews," Patty said. "I know you don't have kids," the girl said with a smirk. "How come you don't have kids?" Patty felt the faintest blush come to her face. "It just never happened. Now let's talk about your future. 'Cause you never did it with your husband." The girl laughed, her teeth were bad. "That's what people say. You know. Fatty Patty never did it with her husband." Igor, never did it with anyone. People say you're a virgin. Patty put the papers flat down on the desk. She could feel her face become flaming hot. For a moment her vision blurred, she heard the ticking of the clock on the wall. In her wildest dreams she could not have anticipated what was going to come out of her mouth. She looked hard at the girl and heard herself say the words, "Get out of here right now, you piece of filth." The girl seemed stunned for just a moment, but then she said, "Hey, wow. They're right. Oh my God." And covering her mouth she made a sound of laughter that grew in length and depth so that Patty had a sense of it spilling from her mouth like bile from some creature in a horror film. "Sorry," the girl said in a moment. "Sorry." From nowhere Patty suddenly knew who the girl was. "Your aunt is Lucy Barton," Patty said. She added, "You look like her." The girl stood up and left the room. Patty closed the door to her office and telephoned her sister Linda, who lived outside of Chicago. Perspiration made Patty's face moist, and she felt her underarms sticky with it. Her sister answered, saying, "Linda Peterson Cornell." "It's me," Patty said. "I figured." "The phone said your school's name." "Well, then how come?" "Listen, Linda." And she told her sister what had just happened. Patty spoke in a rush, leaving out what she had said to the girl. "Can you believe it?" she finished. She heard her sister sigh. After a moment, Linda said she never understood how Patty could work with adolescents anyway. Patty told her she was missing the point. Linda said, "No, I'm not missing the point. The point is Lila Lane, Lucy Barton, Lila this, Lucy that. But who cares about them?" When there was a pause, Linda continued, "Seriously, Patty. The fact that Lucy Barton's niece is such trash should come as no surprise, I mean. Really? Why do you say that?" "Because don't you remember them? They were just trash, Patty." "Oh my God, I just remembered they had those what? Cousins, I think. The boy's name was Abel. Oh my God, he was something. He'd stand in the dumpster behind Chatwin's cake shop and go through the garbage, looking for stuff to eat. Was he that hungry? Why would he do that? But I remember he'd do it with no embarrassment at all. I remember Lucy being with him. It made me shudder. It still does, honestly." His sister's name was Dottie. A scrawny girl. Dottie and Abel Blaine. It's kind of amazing I remember them. But how could I forget? I'd never before seen anyone going through garbage looking for something to eat. He was a handsome kid too. "Gosh," Patty said. The heat from her face had started to go away. She asked, "Didn't Lucy's parents come to your wedding? Your first one?" "I don't remember," Linda said. "You do so remember. How come they came to your wedding?" "Because she invited them, to have people there who would speak to her." "For God's sake, Patty. Just forget that." "I have." Patty said, "Well, maybe you've forgotten, but you still have his name. Peterson. After only a year of being married to him." Linda said, "And why in the world would I want the name nicely back? I never understood why you kept it yourself. The Pretty Nicely Girls. How horrible that we were known as the Pretty Nicely Girls." Patty thought, it wasn't horrible. Linda added, have you seen our mother who is not yet in heaven recently? How's her dippiness factor these days? Patty said, I thought I'd go out there this afternoon. It's been a few days. I need to make sure she's taking her medicine. I don't care if she takes it, Linda said, and Patty said she knew that. Then Patty said, are you in a bad mood or anything? No, I'm not, Linda said. It was a Friday, and in town that afternoon, Patty went to the bank with her paycheck, and then walking down the sidewalk she looked into the bookstore and saw placed right in the front of the display a new book by Lucy Barton. My gosh, Patty said. Inside the bookstore was Charlie Macaulay, and Patty almost walked out when she saw him because he was the only man, other than Sebastian, that she loved. She really loved him. She had liked him for years without knowing him too well, the way people in small towns know one another but don't know one another too. At Sibby's funeral, when she turned and saw him alone in the back row, she fell head over heels in love with him, and she had been in love with him since he was with his grandson, a boy in elementary school, and when Charlie looked up and saw Patty, his face opened, and he nodded. Hi, Charlie, she said, and then she asked the bookstore owner about the book by Lucy Barton. It was a memoir. A memoir? Patty picked it up and glanced through it. Though the words bounced around because of Charlie being so close by. Patty took the book to the register and bought it. She glanced at Charlie on her way out, and he gave her a wave. Charlie Macaulay was old enough to be her father, though he was younger than her father would have been if he had still been alive. But Charlie was at least 20 years older than Patty. He had been in the Vietnam War when he was young. How Patty knew this, she could not have said. His wife was notably plain, and thin as a stick. Patty's house was a few streets away from the center of town. It was not a big house, but it was not a small house either. She and Sibby had bought it together and it had a front porch and a small side porch too. Her peonies were heavy-headed by the side porch and there were irises now in bloom as well. Through her kitchen window she could see the irises as she took a box of cookies from the cupboard. They were Nilla wafers and the box was half full, and then she went into her living room and sat down and ate every one. Then she went back to the kitchen and had a glass of milk. She telephoned her mother to say she would be over in an hour or so, and her mother said, oh, goody. Upstairs, sunlight came through the windows and spilled into the hallway. Little dust bunnies were gathered up and down the floor. Oh dear, Patty said. She said that a few times, sitting on her bed. Oh dear, she said. It was a 20-mile ride to the town of Hanston, and the sun was still bright as Patty drove by the fields, some with the little plants of corn, some brown. One field was being plowed under as she drove by. Then she came to the place where there were wind turbines, over 100 of them along the horizon, these huge white windmills that had been put up across the land almost 10 years earlier. They fascinated Patty, they always had. Their long white arms twirling the air all at the same speed but otherwise without synchronicity. There was a lawsuit now, she remembered. There were often lawsuits about the destruction of birds and deer and farmland. But Patty favored the large white things whose skinny arms moved against the sky in that slightly wacky way to make energy, and then they were behind her, and once Again were only the fields with the little corn plants and the fresh bright soybeans. These were the very cornfields in their summer fullness where, by the age of 15, she had allowed boys to thrust themselves against her. Their lips huge seeming, rubbery, their things bulging through their pants, and she would gasp and offer her neck to be kissed and grind herself against them, but really, she couldn't stand it, she couldn't stand it, she couldn't stand it. Patty came into the town that had changed very little since she had grown up there. There were the old-fashioned looking street lamps, black, with their lights in a box at the top. And there were the two restaurants, the gift shop, the investment firm, the clothing store, all had the same green awnings and signs in black and white. In order to get to her mother's house she had to drive past the home she had grown up in, a beautiful red house with black shutters and a wide porch with a porch swing on it. Patty had sat on that swing with her mother for hours at a time as a young child, curled against her mother's stomach, crumpling the fabric of her mother's dress, her mother's laughter above her head. Her father had lived in that house until he died, which had been 1 year before Sibby died. Now a family with lots of children owned the house, and Patty always, every single time she drove by it, looked the other way through the town. And just a mile past was her mother's small white house. As Patty turned into the driveway, she saw her mother peering through the front curtain, then could hear her cane thump against the floor as Patty unlocked the side door and let herself in. Her mother had become as little as Patty had become big. This is what Patty thought each time she saw her mother now. "Hey," Patty said, and stooped, and kissed the air beside her mother. Standing straight, she said, "I brought you some food." "I don't need food." Her mother had on a terry cloth bathrobe, and she gave the belt a tug. Patty unpacked the meatloaf and the coleslaw and the mashed potatoes, and put them in the refrigerator. "You need to eat something," Patty said. "I won't eat anything sitting alone. Can you stay and eat with me?" Her mother looked up at her through her large glasses, which had slipped partway down her nose. "Pretty please." Patty closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. As Patty set the table, her mother sat in a chair, her legs apart beneath the robe, looking up at Patty. "It's awfully good to see you. I never see you anymore." "I was here 3 days ago," Patty said. Her mother's thin hair, the scalp so visible, stayed in Patty's mind as she turned toward the counter, and inside she felt herself crumble. Returning to the table, pulling a chair up, she said, "We have to talk about you going into the Golden Leaf. Remember we talked about that?" Confusion seemed to appear on her mother's face. She shook her head slowly. "Did you get dressed today?" Patty asked. Her mother looked down at the lap of her bathrobe, and then up at Patty once more. "No," she said. At a conference in St. Louis, Patty had met her husband. The conference was on dealing with children from low-income homes, but Sebastian was not part of that. He was staying in the hotel room next to Patty's, there for a conference himself. He was a mechanical engineer. "Hello again," Patty had said as they both stepped from their rooms. She had seen him at night going into his room when she went into hers. What it was about him, she could not have said, but he made her feel completely comfortable. She was already gaining weight from her antidepressants, and she had once stopped a wedding from happening only weeks before she was to be married. Sebastian would not even look at her the first few times they spoke. But he was a nice-looking man. Tall, thin, his face was gaunt, his hair on the longer side. His eyebrows were so thick they were like one line across his forehead, his eyes indented beneath his brow. She just liked him. And by the end of the conference she had obtained his email address, and their correspondence was something she'd never forget. Within just a few weeks he wrote, "There's something you should know about me, Patty, if we're going to be friends." And then a few days later, "Things happened to me," he wrote. "Awful things. They've made me different from other people." He lived in Missouri, and when she wrote and asked him to come to Carlisle, Illinois, she was surprised that he agreed. After that, they were together. How had she known she hadn't known that he had been taken as a boy again and again and again by his stepfather? Sebastian could hardly stand being with people, but it was very early on that he looked at her and told her in some detail what had happened to him, and he said to her, "Patty, I love you, but I cannot do it. I just cannot do that. I wish I could." And she said, "That's okay, I can't stand it either." In their marriage bed they held hands, and never went any further. Often, during the first years especially, he had terrible dreams, and he would kick the covers and squeal. It was a frightening sound. She noticed that he was aroused when this happened, and she was always sure to touch only his shoulders until he calmed down. Then she rubbed his forehead. "It's okay, honey," she always said. He would stare at the ceiling, his hands in fists. "Thank you," he said, turning his face toward her. "Thank you, Patty," he said. Tell me, smell me. How are you?" Her mother poked a forkful of meatloaf into her mouth. "I'm well. I'm going to see Angelina tomorrow night." Her husband's left her. Patty put mashed potatoes on her meatloaf, then put butter on the mashed potatoes. "I don't know who you're talking about." Her mother placed her fork on the table and looked at her quizzically. "Angelina, she's one of the Mumford girls." "Huh?" Her mother nodded slowly. "Oh, I know. Her mother was Mary Mumford." "Sure. She wasn't much." "Who wasn't much?" "Angelina's a great person. I always thought her mother was really nice." "Oh, she was nice. She just wasn't much. I think she came from Mississippi originally. She married that Mumford boy, he was rich, and then she had all those girls and plenty of money." Patty opened her mouth. She was going to ask if her mother remembered that Mary Mumford had left that rich husband only a few years ago, in her 70s, did she remember that? But Patty wouldn't ask. She would not tell her mother that she and Angelina had become friends over it, mother's leaving. "I wanted to kill him," Sebastian had told Patty. "I really did want to kill him." "Of course you did," she had said. "And I wanted to kill my mother too," he said. And Patty said, "Of course you did." Patty looked around her mother's small kitchen. It was spotless, thanks to Olga, a woman older than Patty who came in twice a week. But the table she sat at had a linoleum top that was cracked at the corners, and the curtains at the window were very faded in their blue. And Patty could see from where she sat, down the hallway to the corner of the living room, the blue beanbag chair that her mother, after all these years, refused to give up. Her mother was talking so often this was the case. These days of things from the past. All those dances at the club. My goodness, they were fun. Her mother paused to shake her head with wonder. Patty put another slab of butter on her potatoes, ate the potatoes, and then pushed the plate aside. Lucy Barton's written a memoir, she said. Her mother said, "What did you say?" And Patty repeated it. "Now I remember," her mother said. "They used to live in a garage, and then the old man died whatever relative he was, I have no idea, but they moved into the house." A garage? Is that where I remember going? A garage? Her mother said, after a moment, "I don't know, I can't remember, but she was very inexpensive, that's why I used her. She did wonderful work really, and she barely charged a nickel for it." After a long moment, her mother said, "I saw Lucy on TV a few years ago. Hot shot. She wrote a book or something. Lives in New York. Smork. La-da-da." Patty took a deep, unquiet breath. Her mother reached for the coleslaw, and as her bathrobe fell open slightly, Patty could see briefly the flattened small breast beneath the nightgown. After a few minutes Patty stood up, cleared the table, and did the dishes rapidly. "Let's check your meds," she said, and her mother waved a hand dismissively. So Patty went into the bathroom and found the container with the divided daily sections, and saw that her mother had not taken any of the pills since Patty was last there. Patty brought the container out to her mother and explained again why each pill was important, and her mother said, "All right." She took the pills that Patty handed her. "You need to take these," Patty told her. "You don't want to have a stroke." She did not say anything about the medicine that was supposed to slow dementia. "I'm not going to have a stroke." Stroke poke. "Okay, I'll see you soon." "You turned out the best," her mother said at the door. "It's too bad your Be Happy pills added that weight, but you're still pretty. Are you sure you have to go?" Walking down the driveway to her car, Patty said out loud, "Oh my gosh." The sun had just set, and by the time Patty was halfway home past the windmills the full moon was starting to rise. The night her father died the moon was full, and in Patty's mind every time the moon became full she felt that her father was watching her. She wiggled her fingers from the steering wheel as a hello to him. "Love you, Daddy," she whispered. And she meant Sibby as well, for they had merged, in a way, in her mind. They were up there watching her, and she knew that the moon was just a rock, but the sight of its fullness always made her feel that her men were out there, up there, too. "Wait for me," she whispered. Because she knew she almost knew that when she died she would be with her father and Sibby again. "Thank you," she whispered, because her father had just told her it was good of her to take care of her mother. He was generous now in this way, death had given that to him. At home, the lights she'd left on made her house appear cozy. It was one of many things she had learned about living alone, leaving lights on. And yet as she put her pocketbook down, moved through the living room, the ghastliness descended. Her day had been a bad one. Lila Lane had shaken her profoundly, and what if the girl reported her, told the principal that Patty had called her a piece of filth? She could do that, Lila Lane. She was up to doing that. Patty's sister had been no help. There was No point in calling her other sister, who lived in LA and never had time to talk, and her mother, oh, her mother. Fatty Patty. Patty said these words aloud. Patty sat down on her couch and looked around. The house seemed faintly unfamiliar, and this was she had learned a bad sign. A taste of meatloaf was in her mouth. Fatty Patty, you get yourself ready for the night, she said out loud, and she rose, and flossed her teeth and then brushed them, and washed her face. She put her face cream on, and this made her feel just a little bit better. When she looked into her pocketbook to find her phone, she saw the small book by Lucy Barton that she had slipped in there earlier. She sat down and examined the cover. It showed a city building at dusk, with its lights on. Then she began to read the book. Holy moly, she said, after a few pages. Oh my gosh. The next morning, Saturday, Patty vacuumed the upstairs of her house and then the downstairs. She changed the bed, did the laundry, and she went through the mail, tossing out the catalogs and flyers. Then Patty went into town and bought groceries, and she bought some flowers too. It had been a long time since she had bought flowers for her house. All day she had the sense of having a piece of yellow-colored candy, maybe butterscotch, tucked inside the back crevices of her mouth, and she knew that this private sweetness came from Lucy Barton's memoir. Every so often Patty shook her head and said "Huh" aloud. In the afternoon she called her mother, and Olga answered. Patty asked her if she could come every day now instead of 2 days a week, and Olga said she'd have to think about it, and Patty said she understood. Then Patty asked to speak to her mother. Who is this? Her mother asked. And Patty said, it's me, Patty. Your daughter. I love you, Mom. In a moment her mother said, well, I love you too. After that, Patty had to lie down. She could not have said the last time she'd told her mother she loved her. As a child she had said it frequently, she may have even said it that morning when her mother agreed that Patty didn't have to be in Girl Scouts anymore, Patty being a freshman in high school, and her mother said, oh, Patty, that's okay, you're old enough now to decide. Her mother standing in the kitchen handing her lunch to her in a paper bag, just being herself, Patty's mother. And then Patty had come home from school that same day, in the middle of the day, with cramps, terrible cramps. Patty used to have, and Patty came home, and she heard the most astonishing sounds coming from her parents' bedroom. Her mother was crying, gasping, shrieking. And there was the sound of skin being slapped, and Patty had run upstairs and seen her mother astride Mr. Delaney, Patty's Spanish teacher, and her mother's breasts were swaying and this man was spanking her mother, and his mouth reached up and took her mother's breast, and her mother wailed. And what Patty never forgot was the look of her mother's eyes. They were wild. Her mother could not stop herself from wailing. This is what Patty saw, her mother's breasts and her mother's eyes looking at her, yet unable to stop what was coming from her mouth. Patty had turned and run into her bedroom. After a few minutes, Mr. Delaney's footsteps were heard going down the stairs, and her mother came into her room, a housecoat around her, and her mother said, Patty, I swear to God you must never tell a soul, and when you're older, you'll understand. That her mother's breasts were so big Patty would not have imagined seeing them unharnessed and swinging over that man. Within days, horrible scenes occurred in a home that had once been so placid and ordinary that Patty had not considered it so. Patty did not, in fact, tell anyone what she had seen. She wouldn't have known what words to use, but she never returned to Mr. Delaney's class, and then it was so sudden, her mother, after exploding in a confession, moved into a tiny apartment in town. Patty went to see her there only once, and there was a blue beanbag chair in the corner. The entire town talked of her mother's affair with Mr. Delaney, and to Patty it felt like her head had been cut off and was moving in a different direction from her body. It was the oddest thing, and it went on and on, that feeling. She and her sisters watched as their father wept. They watched as he swore, and became stony-faced. He had been none of these things before, not a weeper, or a swearer, or a stony-faced man. And he became all these things, and the family they had all just been innocently sitting in a boat on a lake, it seemed like was gone, turned into something never imagined. The town talked and talked. Patty, being the youngest, had to wait it through the longest. By Christmas, Mr. Delaney had left town, and Patty's mother was alone. When Patty began to go to the cornfields with the boys in her class, and even much later, when she had real boyfriends and she did it with them, there was always the image of her mother, shirtless, braless, her breasts swaying as that man grabbed one in his mouth. No, Patty could not stand any of it. Her own excitement caused her always terrible, and terrifying, shame. Angelina was still slim and youthful looking, although she was a few years older than Patty. Yet when Patty saw them both briefly in the mirror at Sam's place, she thought that she, Patty, looked much younger and that Angelina looked drawn. Right away Patty was going to tell Angelina about the book by Lucy Barton. But as soon as they sat down, Angelina's green eyes swam with tears. And Patty reached across the table and touched her friend's hand. Angelina held up a finger, and in a minute she was able to speak. "I just hate both of them," she said, and Patty said she understood. "He said to me, 'You're in love with your mother,' and I was so surprised. Patty, I just stared at him. Oh boy." Patty sighed and sat back. A few years ago Angelina's mother, at the age of 74, had left town, had left her husband to marry someone in Italy almost 20 years younger than she was. Patty had tremendous sympathy for Angelina regarding this. But she wanted to say right now, "Listen to this. Lucy Barton's mother was awful to her. And her father, oh dear God, her father, but Lucy loved them, she loved her mother, and her mother loved her. We're all just a mess, Angelina, trying as hard as we can. We love imperfectly, Angelina, but it's okay." Patty had been dying to tell her friend this, but she sensed now how paltry, almost nutty her words would seem. And so Patty listened about Angelina's children, in high school, almost ready to fly the coop. She listened about the mother in Italy, how she emailed all her girls. Angelina had 4 sisters and how Angelina was the only one who had not gone to see her mother, but Angelina was thinking about it, she might go this summer. "Oh, go," said Patty. "Do go. I think you should." "I mean, she's old, Angelina." "I know." Patty was aware of how much Angelina wanted to talk about herself, and yet this didn't disturb Patty. She merely noticed it. And she understood everyone, she understood, was mainly and mostly interested in themselves. Except Sibby had been interested in her, and she had been terribly interested in him. This was the skin that protected you from the world, this loving of another person you shared your life with. A while later, well into her second glass of white wine, Patty told Angelina about Lila Lane, but she said only the fatty Patty stuff, and how they all thought she was a virgin. And then she said, "You know, Lucy Barton wrote." "Oh, for the love of God," said Angelina. "You're as pretty as ever, Patty. Honest to God, to have to listen to that. No one calls you that, Patty." "They might. I've never heard it, and I hear kids all day long." "Patty, you can still meet a man. You're lovely. You really are." "Charlie Macaulay is the only man who interests me," Patty said. This was the wine. "He's old, Patty. You know, he's a mess." "In what way is he a mess?" "I just mean he was in the Vietnam War years ago and he's got terrible PTSD." "He does?" Angelina gave a tiny shrug. "I heard that." "I don't know who from, but years ago I heard it." "I don't know, really." "His wife is well, you've got a chance, Patty." Patty laughed. "His wife always seemed nice." "Oh, come on, she's an anxious old thing. I'm telling you, go for a spin with Charlie." And then Patty wished she hadn't said anything. But Angelina didn't seem to notice. It was herself and her husband she wanted to talk about. "I asked him right out the other night on the phone, 'Are you going to start divorce proceedings?' and he said no, he didn't want to do that. So I let it drop. I don't know why he'd leave, but not want a divorce." "Oh, Patty." In the parking lot, Angelina put her arms around Patty. And they hugged, squeezed each other tight, for a moment. "I love you," Angelina called out as she got into her car, and Patty said, "Back at you." Patty drove carefully. The wine had made her feel things. Although she was not supposed to drink with her antidepressants. But her mind felt large now, and through it went many things. She thought of Sebastian, and wondered if anyone knew what she had not known. Until he told her the unspeakable things that had happened to him. She wondered now if it had showed. Something showed, certainly. She remembered how she'd heard in the clothing store one day, as she'd left with Sebastian, the young clerk saying to another clerk, "It's like she has a dog." In Lucy Barton's memoir, Lucy wrote how people were always looking to feel superior to someone else, and Patty thought this was true. Tonight the moon was behind Patty, almost, and she saw it in the rearview mirror and winked at it. Her sister Linda came into her mind. Linda saying she didn't know how Patty could work with adolescents. Patty, driving, shook her head. Well, that's because Linda never knew. No one except Sebastian ever knew. After Sibby's death, Patty had gone to a therapist. She had planned on telling this woman. But the woman wore a navy blue blazer and sat behind a big desk, and she asked Patty how she felt about her parents' divorce. "Bad," Patty had said. Patty couldn't figure out how to stop going to this therapist. Until she lied and said she couldn't afford it anymore. Now, as Patty drove into her driveway and saw the lights she'd left on, she realized that Lucy Barton's book had understood her. That was it, the book had understood her. There remained that sweetness of a yellow-colored candy in her mouth. Lucy Barton had her Own shame, oh boy did she have her own shame. And she had risen right straight out of it. Huh, said Patty, as she turned the car engine off. She sat in the car for a few moments before she finally got out and went inside. On Monday morning Patty left a note with the homeroom teacher asking Lila Lane to come to her office, but she was surprised nevertheless when the girl showed up the next period. Lila, said Patty. Come in. The girl walked into Patty's office, and Patty said, have a seat. The girl looked at her warily, but she spoke right away and said, I bet you want me to apologize. No, Patty said. Nope. I asked you to come here today because the last time you were here I called you a piece of filth. The girl looked confused. Patty said, when you were in here last week, I called you a piece of filth. You did? The girl asked. She sat down slowly. I did. I don't remember. The girl was not belligerent. After you asked why I had no children and said I was a virgin and called me Fatty Patty, I called you a piece of filth. The girl watched her with suspicion. You are not a piece of filth. Patty waited, and the girl waited, and then Patty said, when I was growing up in Hanston, my father was a manager of a feed corn farm. And we had plenty of money. We were comfortable, you'd call it. We had enough money. I have no business calling anyone a piece of filth. The girl shrugged. I am. No, you're not. Well, I guess you were angry. Of course I was angry. You were really rude to me. But that did not give me the right to say what I said. The girl seemed tired, she had circles under her eyes. I wouldn't worry about it, she said. I wouldn't think about it anymore if I were you. Listen, Patty said. You have very good scores and excellent grades. You could go to school if you wanted to. Do you want to? The girl looked vaguely surprised. She shrugged. I dunno. My husband, Patty said, thought he was filth. The girl looked at her. After a moment she said, he did. He did. Because of things that had happened to him. The girl looked at Patty with large, sad-looking eyes. She finally let out a long sigh. Oh boy, she said. Well, I'm sorry I said that shit about you. That stuff about you. Patty said, you're 16. 15. You're 15. I'm the adult, and I'm the one who did something wrong. Patty was startled to see that tears had begun to slip down the girl's face, and the girl wiped them with her hand. I'm just tired, Lila said. I'm just so tired. Patty got up and closed the door to her office. Sweetie, she said. Listen to me, honey. I can do something for you. I can get you into a school. There will be money somewhere. Your grades are excellent, like I said. I was surprised to see your grades, and your scores are really high. My grades weren't as good as yours are. And I went to school because my parents could afford to send me. But I can get you into a school, and you can go. The girl put her head down on her arms on Patty's desk. Her shoulders shook. In a few minutes she said, looking up, her face wet, I'm sorry. But when someone's nice to me, oh God, it just kills me. That's okay, Patty said. No, it's not. The girl wept again, steadily, and with noise. Oh God, she said, wiping at her face. Patty handed her a tissue. It's okay. I'm telling you. It is all going to be okay. The sun was bright, washing over the steps of the post office as Patty walked up them that afternoon. In the post office was Charlie Macaulay. "Hi, Patty," he said. And nodded. "Charlie Macaulay," she said. "I'm seeing you everywhere these days. How are you?" "Surviving." He was headed for the door. She checked her mailbox, pulled from it the mail, and was aware that he had left. But when she walked outside, he was sitting on the steps, and to her surprise only it was not that surprising. She sat down next to him. "Whoa," she said, "I may not be able to get up again." The step was cement, and she felt the chill of it through her pants, though the sun shone down. Charlie shrugged. "So don't. Let's just sit." Later, for years to come, Patty would go over it in her mind, there sitting on the steps, how it seemed outside of time. Across the street was the hardware store, and beyond that was a blue house, the side of it lit with the afternoon sun. It was the tall white windmills that came to her mind. How their skinny long arms all turned, but never together, except for just once in a while two of them would be turning in unison, their arms poised at the same place in the sky. Eventually Charlie said, "You doing okay these days, Patty?" She said, I'm fine," and turned to look at him. His eyes seemed to go back forever, they were that deep. After a few moments Charlie said, "You're a Midwestern girl, so you say things are fine. But they may not always be fine." She said nothing, watching him. She saw how right above his Adam's apple he had forgotten to shave, a few white whiskers were there. "You sure don't have to tell me what's not fine," he said, looking straight ahead now, "and I'm sure not going to ask. I'm just here to say that sometimes," and he turned his eyes back to hers. His eyes were pale blue. She noticed that sometimes things aren't so fine. "No siree, Bob. They aren't always fine." "Oh," she wanted to say, wanting to put her hand on his. Because it was himself he was speaking of, this came to her then. "Oh, Charlie," she wanted to say. But she sat next to him quietly, and a car went by on Main Street, then another. "Lucy Barton wrote a memoir," Patty finally said. "Lucy Barton." Charlie stared straight ahead, squinted. "The Barton kids, Jesus, that poor boy, the oldest kid." He shook his head just slightly. "Jesus Christ. Poor kids. Jesus H. Christ." He looked at Patty. "I suppose it's a sad book." "It's not. At least I didn't think so." Patty thought about this. She said, "It made me feel better, it made me feel much less alone." Charlie shook his head. "Oh no. No, we're always alone." For quite a while they sat in companionable silence, with the sun beating down on them. Then Patty said, "We're not always alone." Charlie turned to look at her. He said nothing. "Can I ask you?" Patty said. "Did people think my husband was strange?" Charlie waited a moment, as though considering this. "Maybe. I'm the last person around here to know what people think. Sebastian seemed to me to be a good man." "In pain?" "He was in pain." "Yeah. He was." Patty nodded. Charlie said, "I'm sorry about that." "I know you are." The sun splashed brightly against the blue house. After many moments had gone by, Charlie turned again to look at her. He opened his mouth as though about to say something, but then he shook his head and closed his mouth once more. Patty felt without knowing what it was that she understood what he was going to say. She touched his arm just briefly, and in the Sunday sat cracked. When Linda Peterson Cornell saw the woman who would be staying in their home for the week, she thought, oh, this will be the one. The woman's name was Yvonne Tuttle, and she had been brought to the house by another woman from the photography festival, Karen Lucy Toth, who stood silently beside Yvonne as Linda welcomed her. Yvonne was very tall and had slightly wavy brown hair that went to her shoulders. Her face had possibly been quite pretty 10 years earlier. Now there were lines beneath the eyes that diminished their blue gaze, and also Yvonne wore too much makeup for someone who was clearly past 40. Linda was 55. Yvonne's sandals, with high cork wedges, made her even taller. They gave away to Linda the fact that Yvonne had, in her youth, most likely not come from much. Shoes always gave you away. In the garden of Linda and J. Peterson Cornell's house were two sculptures by Alexander Calder, both on one side of the large and bright blue swimming pool. Inside the house on the walls of the living room were two Picassos and an Edward Hopper. There was also an early Philip Guston at the end of the sloping hallway that led to the guest area. Come, Linda directed, and both the other women followed her down the hallway, which swerved around a corner then led through the long, glass-paneled walkway that finally opened into the guest suite. Linda nodded to the maid to indicate that she could leave, then Linda waited for Yvonne to say something. Yvonne just kept glancing around, gripping the handle of her wheelie suitcase, and said nothing about the house, which, even if you did not recognize the art on the walls, astonishing. For a photographer not to recognize art was still worth commenting on. The house had been renovated a few years earlier, and what the architect had done was inspired. The guest room was all glass. Where's the door? Yvonne finally said. There is no door, Linda said. She could have told Yvonne that there was no need to worry about privacy, as she and her husband stayed upstairs in the front of the house and the back garden had no houses overlooking it. But Linda did not say this. Instead she showed Yvonne the bathroom across the hall, which also had no door and was in the shape of a V and had no shower curtain or stall. The shower nozzle simply protruded from the wall. The floor was tilted to take the running water away. I've never seen anything like this, Yvonne said, and Linda told her that everyone said that. Karen Lucy Toth had continued to stand silently near Yvonne this whole time. She was the most famous of the photographers at the summer festival and the one who came back every year. Linda knew that Karen Lucy had asked if Yvonne Tuttle could teach a class this summer, and the directors had agreed, although Yvonne's portfolio was not as strong as the festival usually required. But no one at the festival wanted to lose Karen Lucy. The students loved her, and her work was well known, and also Karen Lucy's husband had thrown himself off the top of the Sheraton in Fort Lauderdale 3 years before. Karen Lucy Toth got a pass on everything, including politeness. Linda thought, because when she said now to Karen Lucy, I don't believe you've been inside this house before, Karen Lucy, also tall, also with brown hair. They could have been sisters, Linda observed, only said in her extraordinarily thick Alabama accent, I have not. After that, Yvonne and Karen Lucy went away, and Linda, watching through the kitchen window as they walked down the road, saw them talking intently to each other and felt sure they were talking about her. Linda was jealous of Karen Lucy Toth. She knew this. it was not a suppressed feeling because Karen Lucy was famous and childless and still pretty, and because she had no husband. Linda would have liked her own husband, whose intelligence had once impressed her so, to simply disappear. The town hosting the photography festival was a small town about an hour outside of Chicago, with a library, and a school and a church and a bright red hardware store that had a row of mason jars in its front window. There were also 2 cafes and 3 restaurants and 1 bar that at night often played live music. The houses near the center of town were large and old and well kept, their porches cluttered this time of year with big pots of geraniums and petunias. The trees in town were tall oaks and black walnuts, and the boughs of honey locusts and choke cherries were pendulous, so that when there were no children playing in the park or in the schoolyard, the trees could be heard with their own sound of whispers. And sometimes there was the tinkling sound of ash leaves. 2. A private high school that had gone bankrupt years earlier and eventually been forced to close was still available parts of it for the classrooms of the photography festival. In order to get to these buildings, you needed to walk through pathways so thick with bushes and tree boughs that houses were only glimpsed as one passed by. It had almost a fairy tale quality to it. The town. Yvonne Tuttle said this to Karen Lucy Toth. And Karen Lucy said she thought that too. They had just arrived at the building where a welcoming reception was being held. Joy Gunterson, the director of the festival, had black ringlets and she was short and strikingly skinny. She thanked Yvonne for coming, saying that she was happy to include any friend of Karen Lucy Toth's. It seemed to Yvonne that Joy Gunterson's eyes kept looking up toward the ceiling during this conversation, and after Joy walked away, Yvonne told this to Karen Lucy, who said, "Oh, remind me," just as a woman walked up to them, dressed like someone from the 60s, with a pillbox hat and a short coat, and a little pocketbook that matched her high heels. This woman threw her arms around Karen Lucy, and Yvonne saw that the woman was a man. "I'm crazy about Karen Lucy," he told Yvonne, and Karen Lucy puckered her lips and said, "Dollface, you are just the sweetest little boyfriend I know." "You two look like sisters," the man said. His shaved beard showed through his makeup, and his features were fine, almost perfect in their proportions. "We are sisters," Yvonne answered. "Ripped apart at birth." Savagely, Karen Lucy added, "But we're together now. Look at that sweet pocketbook on your darlin' wrist." "What's your name?" Yvonne asked. "Thomasina. Here. At home, Tom." He gave a graceful shrug, a subdued girlish bounce. "Got it," Yvonne said. Linda did not comment as she got into bed next to her husband, and Jay did not comment either, although it was unusual these days for Linda to watch with him on the laptop that Jay held against his knees. They both gazed at Yvonne, who had arrived back at the house so late that neither of them had stayed in the living room waiting for her. Now she tossed her keys onto the bed, and her sigh could be heard through the audio. Yvonne put her hands to her hips and looked all around her. Then she went into the bathroom, where the cameras caught her staring so intently at the shower nozzle, which naturally gave the effect of Yvonne staring straight at them, that a shot of fear went through Linda, but Yvonne, surprising to Linda, chose not to shower and only used the toilet instead, washed her face, brushed her teeth, and came back into the guest room, where she stood again, looking through the huge panes of glass that now showed the blackness of night. Finally she opened her small suitcase and undressed. Her body was more youthful looking than Linda would have thought, but height could do that for you. Her breasts were still firm appearing, and her thighs were in the somewhat grainy light of the camera smooth. She kept her underpants on, and donned a pair of white pajamas that gave her the look, with her hair now in a low ponytail, of someone almost as young as their daughter. But of course she was not. She was a middle-aged woman a long way from her home in Arizona, and she reached for her cell phone and the ringing sounded quietly through the laptop on Jay's knees. "Talk low," they heard Yvonne say. "I've got you on speakerphone while I unpack. I mean, this guest house, or room, or whatever it is miles away, but you never know. Geez. Hey, honey child." Unmistakably the voice of Karen Lucy Toth. "You okay?" "No," said Yvonne. Her voice was muffled. She was facing away, pulling things from her suitcase. "It's creepy here, Karen Lucy. How am I ever going to sleep?" "Take a pill, honey. You know, I think I heard they got all their money from his father, who was in plastics." "What's that mean, I wonder, to be in plastics?" "The weirdos you're staying with. They're in plastics. Can you take a pill, baby doll?" "Yeah, I will." As Yvonne spoke, she sat on the bed and rummaged through her bag, and Linda and Jay watched her squint at a pill bottle, which she opened. Then she brought from the same bag 2 small bottles of wine, the type that could be purchased on an airplane. She unscrewed the top from one and tilted it back. "I know you're tired," she said. "I'm really okay." She added that Tom, or Thomasina, his wife, doesn't mind. Not as long as he does it away from home and without the kids around. "I'd mind," Karen Lucy said, "but if you really loved him, maybe I wouldn't mind. I don't know. I honestly don't. No. Good night. I love you." "Love you too, baby." Linda glanced at her husband's profile. She said, she didn't even shower, and she traveled all day. Jay put a finger to his lips and nodded. Linda rose then and left the room to sleep across the hall, as she always did ever since her daughter moved away, saying those awful things about her. Linda had slept away from her husband. 7 years earlier a young woman in town had disappeared. She was a sophomore in high school and a cheerleader, and also she babysat for the families of the Episcopalian church of which her family was a member. So there were many people to investigate, and of course, the town was in dreadful distress. A deep resentment of the media, which swarmed the town with an almost biblical descent of cameras and large furry microphones, and trucks with huge satellite dishes that scooped at the air. The resentment of this united most people, but then strange alliances formed and ruptured according to what theory was popular that day. For example, when the driver's ed teacher was thought to be a suspect, that really divided people. And then there were a few who said the girl had actually run away, that nobody knew the terrible things that took place in her home, and this added to the dismay and horror that her poor parents and siblings endured. For 2 years the town lived this way. During this time Linda Peterson Cornell existed with a confusing disk of darkness deep inside her chest, and as she watched her husband read the news reports, and follow the case on TV, she often broke out in a sweat. She thought she had to be crazy. She could not imagine why her body was reacting this way, why her mind itself could Not stay calm. And then when it was over, finally over, she forgot that she had felt this way. Only occasionally would she remember, but never with the visceral aspect of what she had actually gone through. And each time she remembered she thought, I'm a silly woman, I have nothing to complain about, not really, not like that, Jesus God. The second night of the festival, Linda sat reading in the living room with her husband, and Yvonne came through the front door and walked past them down the ramp to the lower floor. She flapped a hand as she went by. Good night, she called. But how are you? Jay called back. How's the teaching going? Fine. This was said from downstairs. Got an early class. Good night, she called again. They could hear the very faint sound of the shower not long, and they sat reading in the living room for another 2 hours. In the middle of the night, through the shield of her sleeping pill, Linda was aware of her husband in the shower. It was not unusual, particularly, but it gave Linda a sense of unease. It always did, and tonight reminded her of what she had felt 7 years before. Just the relief of that time now being over allowed her to fall back into sleep. Each night Karen, Lucy and Yvonne went to the bar that played live music. Each night they asked Thomasina if he wanted to go with them, and each night Thomasina said no, he was going back to his room to call his wife and his kids and to read over the assignments for the next day. He's not a bad photographer, Karen Lucy told Yvonne. If he loved it with his whole heart, he might be really good. But he doesn't love it with his whole heart. He just comes here because. They nodded simultaneously, picking at the corn chips in the basket on the table. Bless his soul, Karen Lucy added. Totally. And his wife's too. Hell yeah. Karen Lucy put a hand to her mouth. If I was betrayed. Betrayed. I want you to know that. Yvonne nodded. That's all I'm going to say. Yvonne nodded again. My heart is broken, Karen Lucy said. I know that, Yvonne said. Broken. He broke my heart. Karen Lucy flicked a corn chip and it flew across the table. After a number of minutes went by, Yvonne asked. Why do Joy's eyes roll around when she's talking to me? Oh. 'Cause her son killed a girl here years ago and buried her in the backyard and then finally told his mama. Yes, darlin', I am serious. Karen Lucy nodded. He's in prison now for the rest of his life, however long or short that may be. Joy and her husband got divorced. And her husband got all the money. They were rich, but he got all the money and Joy lives in a trailer now outside of town, and if you go there you will see a photograph she has on her mantle, taken of her standing right next to her son, and she has her hand on his chest. In this gesture of affection, but it covers up the numbers on his uniform, so the photograph looks like he's just wearing a dark blue shirt. God, Yvonne said. My God. I know. How old was he when he did this? 15, I think. 16. They charged him as an adult because he didn't tell anyone for almost 2 years. Just left her buried in their backyard. If he'd told, he wouldn't have gotten life. But he got life. Without parole. A dog didn't dig up the body. No, ma'am, that did not happen. I guess he buried her deep enough. Karen Lucy held up 2 fingers. 2 years, and he says, Mama, I got to tell you something. What happened to the family of the girl? They moved. Joy's ex-husband left too. Won't have anything to do with his son at all. Wiped his hands clean. Joy goes every month to see her boy in Joliet. Yvonne shook her head slowly, drew her fingers through her hair. "Wio," she said. After a long silence, Karen Lucy said, "I'm awful sorry. You never had your kids, Ivi. I know you wanted kids so bad." "Well," said Yvonne. "You know. You'd have been a good mama, I do know that." Yvonne looked at her friend. "It's life. It's all just friggin' life." "Yes, it is," Karen Lucy said. "Yes, it is." The next morning, which was 3 mornings after she had first arrived, Yvonne Tuttle approached Linda at the kitchen sink. Linda had not known Yvonne was still in the house, and she was startled to find the woman standing behind her as she washed her coffee cup. "Have you seen my white pajamas?" Yvonne asked with direct curiosity. "Why would I have seen your pajamas?" Linda placed the coffee cup in the drainer. "Well, because they're missing. I mean, they're just gone. And things don't just go. If you see what I mean." "I don't." Linda dried her hands on the dish towel. "Well, I mean my white pajamas that I put each morning beneath my pillow are gone." Yvonne made a sign with her arms, like an umpire calling it safe. "Gone. And they have to be somewhere, so I thought I'd ask. I mean, maybe the maid took them to wash them or something." "The maid did not take your white pajamas." Yvonne looked at her for a long moment. "Huh," she said. Linda felt fury rising in her, almost uncontrollable. "We do not go stealing things in this house." "I was just asking," Yvonne said. During the last weekend of the festival, a show was mounted in the same room at the former private high school where the welcoming reception had been. On one side were the faculty photographs, and on the other were student photographs. Yvonne stood with Karen Lucy and Thomasina off to the side, watching people move slowly around the room. "I hate this," Yvonne said. Thomasina switched his pocketbook to his other wrist. "Karen Lucy, do you get used to people staring at your photographs? Look at the way that woman there is tilting her head, she's wondering what the cracked plates in your photos mean." Karen Lucy said, "They mean I'm cracked up." Thomasina smiled with deep affection at Karen Lucy. "You crack me up," he said. "Sweetheart, I wanna take you home. You know, that lady's a rich culture vulture, I can just tell by the back of her head. Shitten in high cotton, that girl. Just by the damn thing." Karen Lucy turned away. "Oh God, she's the woman whose house I'm in," said Yvonne. "Oh, let's go," Karen Lucy said, "right now, baby doll." The sun was very bright and they all three stood for a moment on the wooden porch, squinting. Thomasina reached for his sunglasses. "It's hot," he said. "I didn't know it was so hot outside. I have my nylons on." "They look nice," Yvonne said. "You look nice." "Doesn't he always just look so nice?" Karen Lucy made a kissing sound in Thomasina's direction. "Lord, it is hotter than 2 rabbits screwin' in a wool sock." A man's voice startled them from behind. "Girls and boys," it said. It was J. Peterson Cornell. He had just stepped through the door they had walked through. "Had enough of your exhibit?" he asked. He held out his hand toward Karen Lucy. "I'm Jay," he said, and for a moment the sunlight glinted on his glasses, then his eyes came into view. "A real pleasure to meet you." Love your work. Thank you, Karen Lucy said. Can I get you girls something cool to drink? Karen Lucy said, we have an appointment, I'm afraid. I see. Jay turned in the direction of Yvonne. We haven't seen much of you this week. Have you enjoyed yourself in our little town? Or do you find it dull compared to the funky scene of Tucson? I like your little town. Yvonne felt sweat run down her back. Come on, y'all. Nice to meet you, Mr. J. Karen Lucy moved to the steps, and Yvonne and Thomasina followed. The three of them walked single file through the pathway in the woods that led back toward town, and none of them spoke until they came to a clearing by the church. I need a drink, said Yvonne. In the bar, Thomasina said, he didn't even acknowledge me, did you notice? Course not, honey, said Karen Lucy. He ain't gonna acknowledge anyone he can't do. I don't know why he makes me feel creepy, said Yvonne. Because he is creepy. I'm telling you. Karen Lucy pointed her swizzle stick at Yvonne. It's not like he looks creepy. He looks normal. Yvonne picked up a chip, put it back into the basket. Karen Lucy let out a long sigh. For 100 years I waitressed in my youth, and, child, I got to know some things. I got to know men's eyes. Karen Lucy tapped the swizzle stick to her cheekbone. And this man, baby doll, thinks you are a big old tall piece of trash, that's what he thinks. He'd think the same about me, but I've won some awards, and he'd rather hang me on his wall. And when you win your awards, and you will, he'll want you on his wall beside his fucking freezing cold Picasso. But right now he is sniffing your panties and tucking your pretty white pajamas under his pillow each night. Yvonne gave small nods. Thank you. She added, I'm serious. I know you're serious. Whoa, said Thomasina. This is sad stuff I'm hearing. Karen Lucy looked at Thomasina's profile with a serious hard look. Then she put her hand on his and said, you are to worry about nothing. You are doing just fine. Linda and J. Peterson Cornell sat in the living room, waiting up to speak to their house guest. Every night she had come in later and later, and when she came in she always said hello, good night and kept right on walking down the ramp in her wedge-heeled sandals. The night after Jay and Linda had been to the exhibit, Jay said, she doesn't give us the time of day. Without looking at him, turning the page of her magazine, Linda said, when I first saw her I thought maybe you'd run off with her. Jay laughed. Did you? Because of her slightly slutty kind of working class look? I don't think it's just a look, Linda said. No. Clearly not. Linda should have sensed she did sense her husband's heightened state. She did not watch with him. Again the view of Yvonne in the bedroom or the bathroom. She did not mention to him that Yvonne had reported her white pajamas missing. On the last night of Yvonne's stay, Linda sat with him in the living room, and toward midnight Yvonne came in. You've been burning your candle at both ends, Jay called out to her. I have been. Sleep well, Yvonne called back, disappearing down the ramp. Would you come here for a moment, please? Jay called. He stayed sitting and Linda sat next to him, holding a newspaper open on her lap. After a moment, Yvonne came back up the ramp. Yes, she said. Have you a family? Jay asked her. Are you divorced? Am I divorced? That's what I asked. Well, Geez. Yvonne put a hand to her forehead. There's a conversation starter. Is that the first thing you usually ask middle-aged women when you meet them? You look divorced, Jay said. Yvonne shook her head quickly in tiny gestures. Okay. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to bed. You've stayed in our house for more than a week. Linda said. And you've never once had a conversation with us. You'll understand if we feel rebuffed. We opened our home to you. Oh. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. This seemed to have hit home, and Linda sensed immediately how little confidence the woman really had. How her mother had probably tried to bring her up right, but a desperation was inherited. Yvonne stepped into the living room. I didn't mean to be rude. I've just been really tired each night. Sit, Jay said pleasantly, nodding toward a chair. The woman sat. Her legs were very long and the chair she sat in was low to the ground, so her knees stuck up like a cricket's. Linda could see she was uncomfortable. And Linda was not sorry. So tell us. You live in Arizona? Have you lived there long? Linda asked. Yeah, said Yvonne. Basically. You know, most of my adult life. Our daughter was thinking of moving to New Mexico. But she went east instead, Jay said, smiling. She lives in Boston now. Yeah? How old is she? She's 23 and very much enjoying her independence from us. It's natural at that age. Jay was still smiling. She has a twin brother who lives in Providence, and he's enjoying his independence as well. He added. Karen Lucy has done some wonderful work recently, Linda said. Hasn't she? Yvonne sat forward, but her knees were too high, so she had to sit back and stretch her legs out. And she looked undeniably inviting. The whole Earthquake series. I think she's brilliant. Those cracked plates. Yvonne shook her head appreciatively, tried sitting up straight again. Some artists are so competitive. Even with their friends, Jay said. But I guess you can be generous since your own work's been successful. And rightly so, might I add. I'm sure you're just generous anyway, Linda said. She thought Yvonne looked wary. Let me get us some wine, she said. There was no doubt about what she felt. Jay had had his successes before, but Linda had never felt as complicit. In another 20 minutes Linda excused herself and went to bed. She listened intently, and fairly soon she heard Yvonne going downstairs and walking through the walkway to her room. The door to her husband's room shut quietly. And Linda took her sleeping pill. Somewhere in a dream Linda heard screaming. The sound was terrifying. Honey, said Jay. He was speaking to her from the doorway and her bedroom light was on. There's been a little issue. Sitting up quickly, she was certain she heard the doorbell ring. She said, Jay, I was just dreaming. Let me do the talking, Jay said. He smiled at her, but she thought he looked different, as though his face was broader than she had noticed before, and his face was moist with perspiration. She put on her robe and followed him downstairs. When he opened the door, two policemen stood there. Linda saw behind them another policeman and also a policewoman and, in the driveway, the two white police cars. The policemen were very polite. Can you show us where the guest room is? Where you had the guest Yvonne Tuttle staying? Jay said, of course. Linda, take them down. Linda's mouth was extremely dry as she turned to go down the ramp to the guest area. The bedroom was in darkness, and as Linda started to enter, her hand reaching for the light switch, the policewoman stopped her, saying, "No, please leave everything." And the policeman said, "Mrs. Peterson, why don't you go back upstairs now?" Linda turned quickly, calling out for Jay. Jay was shaking his head slowly as the policeman stood in the kitchen with their arms at their sides. "We thought she seemed odd from the very beginning, but I'm sure you understand I don't care to discuss any more of this without speaking to my lawyer. I'm represented by Norm Atwood, and you know what he'll say. This is outlandish, entirely ridiculous. I don't imagine the county looks forward to a lawsuit from me." One of the policemen said, "Why don't you ask him to meet us at the station?" "Honestly." Jay smiled. "I know you folks pride yourselves on being meticulous, but this is just outrageous." "Where's Yvonne?" Linda suddenly asked, as the men were gathering by the door. "She's at the county hospital, ma'am," said one of the policemen. "She says I tried to rape her," Jay added. "Yvonne? She did? But that's insane," Linda said. "Of course it's insane," Jay said calmly. "Honey, I'll be back soon." The policewoman stayed behind with one of the policemen. Linda said, "What are you doing?" "Have a seat, Mrs. Peterson. We'd like to ask you a few questions." They were very polite. They asked about Yvonne. "What was she like?" "Oh, horrible," Linda said. "In what way?" "She was rude to us, never spending time with us." Linda suddenly remembered about the pajamas and blurted that out too. "She accused me of stealing her pajamas." The policewoman nodded sympathetically, while the policeman wrote something down. "And was she rude to your husband as well?" Too late, Linda realized that she should have said nothing. They were very nice to her when she said she was not going to talk to them anymore. They explained that a search warrant was being obtained for the guest room, that evidence might be taken, possibly the sheets, pillowcases, things like that. The next morning, Jay slept heavily in their bedroom. Toward dawn, Norm Atwood had brought him home. Jay had been charged with third-degree battery and released on bond. Norm explained that Jay had most likely been charged because Yvonne was in such a condition of hysteria, running down the road at 3 a.m. in underpants and a t-shirt, then knocking on a door in town, and that there was a small bruise on her wrist that could conceivably indicate a struggle. Norm said the state would still have difficulty proving it was not an encounter of consent, that it was always hard to prove with no witnesses the matter of consent. Now Linda sat motionless in the back garden beside the glaring blue swimming pool. In her pocket her cell phone rang, and she clicked it on. Her daughter said, "Fuck you, Mom. Just fuck you both. I'm never coming home again." Linda rose and went inside to the living room and sat on the far end of the couch. She felt a little bit out of body because she had a sensation of being young again. Walking down a road on an early summer evening with schoolgirl friends past fields and fields of corn and fields of soybeans, the whole world filled with the bright green of new life, the sun setting so that the entire sky was colored in glorious celebration, the air on her bare arms. She recalled too, all freedom, all innocence, the laughter. Norm Atwood had arranged an appointment for her in the afternoon to drive to Layton to see her own lawyer. She had marital privilege, he explained. She didn't have to testify against Jay about anything he had told her. But anything she had seen she would be put on the stand to report under oath. Linda tried to understand this as she sat on the couch, but she felt that all parts of her had stopped. She was in neutral. She looked about her. The Hopper painting hung on the wall with an indifference so vast it began to feel personal, as though it had been painted for this moment. Your troubles are huge and meaningless, it seemed to say. There is only the sun on the side of a house. She got up and moved into the dining room, sitting at the long table. A few years earlier, her daughter had found something on her father's computer. And the girl had screamed and screamed and screamed. Dad screws women right in the house, and you do nothing. You're more pathetic than he is, Mom, you make me sick. It had started as a private game, a way of breaking domestic boredom, creating a Linda Peterson Cornell. That seemed daring, provocative, a person her husband appreciated more. While Linda was growing up in northern Illinois, her father had managed a successful feed corn farm. Her mother, a homemaker, had been a scattered woman, but kind. Their last name was Nicely, and Linda and her two sisters were known as the Pretty Nicely Girls. It was a pleasant childhood, and then her mother suddenly it seemed to Linda to happen while she was at school one day, moved out and into a squalid little apartment, and it was the most terrible thing Linda could imagine, worse than if her mother had died. After a few months her mother wanted to return home, but Linda's father refused to allow it, and the image of her mother living alone in a tiny house after the squalid apartment, and having given up her friends, all of whom reacted with fear as though her mother's attempts at freedom might be contagious, terminal, along with the estrangement of her daughters, because their father pulled their loyalty to him. All this was by far the strongest event in Linda's life. The week after Linda graduated from high school, she married a local boy named Bill Peterson. Then she divorced him 1 year later, keeping his name. In college in Wisconsin she met Jay, who with his intelligence and vast money seemed to offer a life that might catapult her away from the terrifying and abiding image of her mother, alone and ostracized. Now, as Linda sat at the end of the dining room table, the doorbell rang, though at first she wasn't sure she had heard right. It rang again. She peeked through the curtains and did not see anyone, so she opened the door cautiously, and it was skinny Joy Gunterson, saying, "Linda, I just had to come over." Linda said, "No you didn't, no you did not. You have nothing in common with me, do you hear? You have nothing in common with me. Go away." "Oh, Linda. But I do. I'm not going to end up living in some trailer, Joy." It amazed her that she said this. No part of her had any inkling she would say that. It seemed to amaze Joy too. The woman, shorter than Linda, had a look of confusion shift onto her face. Probably this mutual surprise prevented Linda from closing the door. So Joy had time to shake her head and say, "Oh, but, Linda, see, it doesn't matter where you live. That's what you find out. When the person you love more than anyone spends his days in a cell, then you're in a cell too. It doesn't matter where you are. You'll find out who are your real friends. They won't be who you think. Trust me on that." Linda closed the door and locked it. She went to the door of Jay's bedroom, but he was still fast asleep and snoring, lying flat on his back. Without glasses his face seemed naked, she had not seen him sleeping for some time. She closed the door and went back downstairs. She did not know what she would say to this lawyer. Norm had said it also depended on whether or not Yvonne continued to want to press charges. A lot depended on Yvonne. Linda walked around the house quietly. She understood that her mind was trying to take in something it could not take in. She thought of Karen Lucy Toth, who must be with Yvonne right now. The police had come to collect Yvonne's things and return them to her. Linda had not asked where Yvonne was. In the kitchen sink were 2 white mugs with coffee stains. Linda couldn't say who had been drinking coffee, how they'd got into the sink. As she washed them, her legs almost gave way. She pictured jurors sitting in a jury box. She pictured Yvonne, with her too much makeup, on the stand. And then she thought of the cameras. Why in the world had she not thought of the cameras? Did you, or did you not, watch women with your husband while they undressed, showered, used the toilet? How long had you been aware that your husband was watching them this way? Driving toward Layton, Linda stopped at a gas station a few miles outside of town. She felt horribly exposed and so did not pull into the self-serve dock, but instead had a man fill up her tank. But then she suddenly had to use the bathroom. With her sunglasses on she went into the store, past the rows of cellophane-wrapped donuts and cakes and peanuts and candy. The filth of the bathroom appalled her. She could not remember the last time she had used a public restroom this filthy, and she thought, why should it matter when now nothing matters? Her mind was scrambled like that, so when she walked back through the store and bumped straight into Karen Lucy Toth, they stared at each other with amazement. Karen Lucy was also wearing sunglasses. She removed them, and her eyes, to Linda, seemed older than Linda would have thought, and sad, and still pretty. You scared me, Linda said. Well, you scared me too. They moved together down the aisle away from the foot traffic. Tall Karen Lucy spoke down. Ma'am, as God's truth, after my own tragedy a few years back, I feel sometimes that I have compassion for everyone. I do. It's probably the only blessing that came from that. But your husband scared my friend, he scared her bad. Where is she? I just took her to the airport. She needs to get home and see a proper doctor. Listen, Linda said. I have no idea about any of it. Karen Lucy's pretty eyes got small. No, now you listen to me. Don't you go pissing down my back end. Then tell me it's raining outside. You have to know something about your husband, and if I takes this to trial, and I hope to hell she will, you'll be called to testify. And it is your duty. I don't know anything about my husband, Linda said coldly. Through her sunglasses she watched Karen Lucy look out the window as though looking far into the distance. Linda saw the pretty eyes redden. Karen Lucy nodded slowly. Quietly she said, oh, child, of course. I am so sorry. She turned her gaze toward Linda, though her focus still seemed far away. I am in no position to tell anyone how they ought to be cognizant and aware of what their husband is up to. I have thrown stones in a glass house, and I am sorry. Almost always it's a surprise, the passing of permission to enter a place once seen as eternally closed. And this is How it was for a stunned Linda, who stood that day in that convenience store with the sun falling over packages of corn chips and heard those words of compassion. Undeserved, for if Karen Lucy had not known her husband's state of mind, Linda knew her own husband's state of mind too well and sensed in them what would turn out to be true, that Yvonne Tuttle and Karen Lucy would never return to town. There would be no trial, no mention of cameras, and Linda would live with her husband in a state of freedom, because he would always know, as they watched the news at night, took walks through the countryside, or sat in a restaurant and chatted, that his exemption from trouble was possibly or partly the result of his wife's discretion, and there would be no more women after that, the guest room perhaps a sunny study neither would enter, a photograph of Karen Lucy's cracked plates on the wall. The essence of this Linda felt that day. She removed her sunglasses to stare into the eyes of this woman. She wanted to reach for her hand. She even wanted with a sudden surprising urgency to caress her cheek, as though Karen Lucy were the pretty nicely girl who had suffered the blow from behind, who had come home from school and found her mother gone, thinking she had been important, loved all along. The hit thumb theory. Waiting for her to arrive, Charlie Macaulay watched from the window as twilight began to gather. Along the top of the soot-darkened wall of the parking area, barbed wire lay coiled, as though even the littered and unlovely motel lot posed such threat or value that it was immediately at war with the rest of the world. For Charlie, this seemed to prove the futility of the dreams presented in the department store windows he had walked by earlier. In this town they had found together, half an hour outside of Peoria, you could buy a snow blower or a nice wool dress for your wife, but beneath it all people were rats scurrying off to find garbage to eat, another rat to hump, making a nest in broken bricks, and soiling it so sourly that one's contribution to the world was only more excrement. But there to the left was the top of a maple tree, the branches holding forth two pinkly yellow leaves with apologetic gentleness, and how had they held on until November? Right behind it was the last of the day's full light, generously, the colors from the setting sun sprayed upward over the open sky. Charlie put his large hand to the side of his face, remembering why should this come to him now, crouching on a small hillside, planting crocus bulbs with Marilyn in the same kind of autumn light. It had been their freshman year at the university. He remembered her eagerness, her eyes large with intent. He had known nothing about planting crocus bulbs, and these, she told him, short-breathed with excitement, would be her first. They had bought a trowel in town that afternoon, and walked up the small hill behind her dormitory to a patch of autumn grass next to the college woods. Okay, here, she said, really anxious. He had seen how serious this was for her, planting her first flowers at the age of 18, with him, her first love. He had been moved by her eagerness, bundled up as she was in her long woolen coat. They dug the holes, put the bulbs in. Bye, good luck, she had said to one bulb. The very stuff that would make him roll his eyes now, her utter foolishness, the useless, nauseating softness that lay at the center of her had thrilled him quietly that day with a rush of love and protectiveness as the autumn smell of earth filled him, kneeling there with the trowel. Dear, befuddled Marilyn, her face flushed with the excitement of the job done. Do you think they'll come up? She had asked worriedly. The poor thing. Always worried. He said they would. And they did. A few did. But he could not remember that part as well. He could only really remember what he had long forgotten. Until right now, a day of innocence in autumn when they were just kids. Charlie closed the window blinds. The blinds were plastic slats, dirty with age, and they clicked into place unevenly as he tugged on the cord. Panic, like a large minnow darting upstream, moved back and forth inside him. He was suddenly as homesick as a child sent to stay with relatives, when the furniture seemed large and dark and strange, and the smell peculiar, each detail assaultive with a differentness that was almost unbearable. I want to go home, he thought. And the desire seemed to squeeze the breath from him. Because it was not his home in Carlisle, Illinois, where he lived with Marilyn, that he wanted to go home to his grandchildren right down the street. And it was not his childhood home either, which was in Carlisle as well. Nor was it their first home as newlyweds outside of Madison. He did not know what home it was he longed for, but it seemed to him as he aged that his homesickness would increase, and because he could not tolerate the Marilyn he now lived with, a woman who nevertheless filled his estranged, expatriated heart with pity. He did not know what he would do, and the minnow darting through the stream of his anxiety landed briefly on his current Carlisle home with his grandchildren down the street. Swam to the golf course where he did still sometimes enjoy the expanse of green before him, swam to the woman who might or might not show up here with her head of dark, glossy hair, and not one place seemed stable. A soft knock came on his motel door. "Hello, Charlie." She smiled, her eyes warm, as she walked past him into the room. He knew instantly. His instincts had been honed in youth, and this ability had never left him, the one to detect disaster. Still, a man needed his dignity. So he nodded, and said, "Tracy." She walked farther into the room, and when he saw that she had brought her overnight bag, and why would she not have, really, he was pathetically and fleetingly gladdened, but then she sat on the bed and smiled at him again, and he knew again. "Take your coat," he asked. She shrugged her way out of it. "Charlie," she said. He watched himself. A little bit, it was fascinating. He was an organism about to be dealt a blow, and he used his natural powers to defend himself. This meant that he observed carefully the pitted parts of her upper cheeks, the pores that were jagged shapes indicating an adolescence he already knew had been hard. He noted the scent on the coat that he held, how even in its faintness it was cloying and unsubtle, and he hung the piece of clothing on the back of the desk chair rather than in the closet next to his own. He observed the way her eyes would not look at him directly, and he thought that he hated dishonesty or lack of courage more than anything. He moved as far away from her as the small room would allow, so that he stood leaning against the wall opposite. Now she looked at him with a sardonic, apologetic expression. "I need money," she said. And she sighed deeply, putting her hand on the bedspread. The fingers each had a ring, including her thumb, and it was still surprising to him how his mind was trying to remind him, "Charlie, for God's sake, take note, how repulsive so many parts of her should be to him and yet were not." The crap of class superiority would protect no man for long. Many lived whole lives and never knew this. Charlie did. "Just tell me," he said. 10. He stayed exactly where he was. On the small table next to the bed his cell phone suddenly vibrated. "Tracy." leaned to look. Your wife, she said, just reporting. Indifferent. Charlie walked to the phone and slipped it into his pocket, where it shuddered in his palm a few moments. Before stopping, he said to Tracy, who remained sitting on the bed, I can't, sweetheart. But you can. Clearly she had not expected this, and that was a surprise to him. No. I can't. You have plenty of money, Charlie. I have a wife and children and grandchildren, is what I have. He had bought champagne because she liked it, and he watched as she noticed it now on the bureau top in the plastic motel bucket he'd filled with ice. She looked back at him ruefully. You break my heart, she said. Of all. He laughed, a bark of a sound. Of all your Johns I break your heart the most. But it's true. She stood and walked to the champagne. And don't be crass, Charlie. I have clients. And you're not one of them. I know you have clients, he said. John's is so, yesterday, for Christ's sake, Charlie. Forget it? No, I'm not forgetting it. Tracy, stop. You and I right now are about to act out one of the oldest stories in the book. And I don't care. 2. I know all the lines, I know all the background music. I don't want he opened his palm to do it, that's all. And I won't. The pain that moved briefly across her face gratified him. He had always felt she loved him, as he did her. But there was suddenly a refreshing simplicity that seemed to move into the room, an unexpected and huge relief, a straightening out of things. Go home and get your things in order, a doctor would say. No. Affairs. Go home and get your affairs in order. That clarification he couldn't help it struck Charlie as funny. He was, in the tiniest way, delighted, as though all those people whose lives had occurred long before he'd been born had known these things, phrases used for years, go home and get your affairs in order. Inside his pocket his phone vibrated again, and he brought it out to see. Marilyn was printed in blue across the screen. Want me to step out? The question was intimate, because it had been asked so many times in the past. The tone was conversational, familiar. He nodded. She slipped her coat back on, and he gave her a room key. He said, they have that tiny lobby, but she said her car was fine, she'd listened to the radio, really, it was no problem. She had always been pretty wonderful that way. It was her job to be wonderful that way. But even after the day she'd told him her real name sitting fully dressed in the chair by the desk, I want to tell you my real name, and brought out her driver's license to prove it, she was still wonderful that way. After the day she showed him her license, she'd insisted that he not offer her money again. Perhaps she'd been mulling this over, and now figured she was owed. Perhaps she was. The door closed quietly behind her. He resisted the urge to look through the blind slats and watch her get into her car. The peculiar hopefulness had not left him, the pleasing understanding that the situation would be over soon, was essentially over already. And it felt quite survivable. Which he had somehow not known. His wife was crying on the phone. Charlie? Oh, I'm sorry to bother you, really I am. You're supposed to be having fun. Well, I know it's not fun, but I mean I know it's your time, and what's happened? He felt no alarm. Oh, Charlie, she was mean to me again. I called you. No, to see if the girls were all set with their Thanksgiving dresses, and Janet said to me, she said, "Marilyn, I'm asking you, no, I'm telling you, I'm just going to come right out and tell you, Marilyn, that you call here too much. This is my house and Stevie is my husband, and we need some space." That's what she said. Charlie. And Stevie, who even knows if he was home? Does he have any spine, our son? Charlie stopped listening. He was absolutely and silently on the side of his children, and on the side of his son's wife. He sat down on the bed. "Charlie," she said. "I'm here." Inadvertently he glanced at himself in the mirror. He had long ago stopped looking like anyone familiar. In a few minutes he had calmed his wife enough to hang up. She'd apologized once more for disturbing him, and said he had made her feel better. He'd answered, "Okay then, Marilyn." Alone in the room with silence he understood the previous hiatus, which had now returned to him, that spaciousness of calm. Long ago he'd assigned a private name to it. The hit thumb theory. On his grandfather's roof as a child one summer, hammering tiles down hard, he'd discovered that if you hammered your thumb by mistake, there was a split second when you thought, "Hey, this isn't so bad, considering how hard I was hit," and then after that moment of false, bewildered, and grateful relief came the crash and crush of real pain. In the war this had happened so often, in so many forms. He'd sometimes thought he was brilliant. The analogy was that APT. In the war he had learned many things, and not one of them had he heard any psychologist mention. During any of the meetings that Marilyn now thought he was attending, Charlie stood up. He felt the itch of desire that was carnal, corporeal. It included much and was not a stranger to him. Arms crossed, he walked back and forth in front of the queen-size bed with its spread that was made of fibers he knew from having felt it many times, meant to endure all things. Back and forth he walked. Back and forth. He had sometimes walked back and forth for hours. A warmth of emotion came to him. He had not, at the time of its construction, been interested in the memorial. No, Charlie Macaulay had not been interested a bit. And yet one day after many nights of being bombarded repeatedly with the memories of Khe Sanh, he took a bus by himself all the way to Washington, and what a thing he found there. He had wept without sound or self-consciousness, walking along the dark granite wall, seeing names he recalled, touching them with his coarsened fingertips, and people nearby. He could sense them, tourists most likely left him alone. With respect, this he could feel, that they were respecting him as he wept. He had never thought such a thing possible. Back in Carlisle he told Marilyn, "It was good I went." She surprised him by saying only, "I'm glad, Charlie." And then later that night she said, "Listen. You go back whenever you need to, I mean it. We have enough money for you to make that trip any time you need it." People could surprise you. Not just their kindness, but also their sudden ability to express things the right way. He felt he never expressed anything the right way. Once he had been in a department store with his son and daughter-in-law. Janet had needed a sweatshirt. Charlie had just been following along, not interested one way or another. But his son was interested, and when Charlie glanced over, suddenly paying attention, he saw his son talking thoughtfully and earnestly to his wife. Janet was a plain and pleasant woman, and it was the glimpse of this, the engagement of his son in this small Domestic exchange, that almost brought Charlie to his knees. What a son! What a man he was, this grown boy! Who would stand so decently and discuss with his wife exactly what sweatshirt she desired in a store that smelled like a circus tent of cheap candy and peanuts and who knows what. His son caught his eye, his face opened. "Hey, Dad, how you doing there? Ready to go?" The word arrived, clean. His son was clean. "I'm good," Charlie said, raising a hand slightly. "Take your time." And because he was Charlie, who years ago had fouled himself profoundly, because he was Charlie and not someone else, he could not say to his son, "You are decent and strong, and none of this has anything to do with me. But you came through it, that childhood that wasn't all roses, and I'm proud of you, I'm amazed by you." Charlie could not even say a watered-down version of whatever that feeling would be. He could not even clap his son on the shoulder in greeting, or when saying goodbye. At the open door of the motel room, he stood gazing at the parking lot so she would know to return, and as she walked from the car toward him he was aware that she was aware of being watched, except he wasn't really watching her, because the smell of autumn had accosted him, the sudden chill, and that earthy, loamy fragrance came over him with something akin to excitement. Careful, he thought. Careful. He stepped back to let her enter. Tracy did not remove her coat this time, and she sat in the chair by the desk instead of on the bed. He saw in her face that she had been preparing. "Please, Charlie. Now. Please just trust me. I need the money. I know you need it. Then please." Perhaps perversely he was waiting to see if she would say he owed it to her, and then for the first time since he'd known her he saw her eyes fill with water. "Ah. Tracy. Tell me. Come on, babe, what is it?" "My son." Both very slowly, and immediately. This is how Charlie experienced it. He understood. Her son was in trouble. With drugs. Owed a man $10,000. This knowledge entered the room like a large dark bird, its wingspan wide and frightening. He asked her directly. She nodded, the tears coming down her cheeks then. Coming. He was oddly fascinated, having never seen her weep before, by the large tracks of mascara dripping onto her clothes, onto the turquoise-colored nylon blouse, the skirt of black, even her boots. His wife had never worn any makeup at all. "Ah, Tracy. Kid, hey, sweetheart." He opened one arm to her, and believed he saw her desire to move to him. And maybe she would have, but he said, "Tracy, you're in danger yourself if you do this." Something about that seemed to offend her deeply. And she shook her head and made fists with her many-ringed hands. "What the fuck do you know? You think you know shit? Well, excuse fucking me, you don't know shit." In this way she helped him. "I can't do it," he said. "Easily. I can't withdraw $10,000 from a bank account just like that and not have Marilyn know. And I'm not going to, anyway." Then her green eyes became like dark nostrils that flared. That is the image that came to him as he watched her eyes moving like the nostrils of a horse, pulled up, pulled back. "My son's going to be dead if I can't come up with this money. No tears now." Her breath came in little bursts. Very slowly Charlie seated himself on the edge of the bed, facing her. Finally, quietly, he said, "You understand. I had no idea you had a son." "Well, Of course I didn't tell you. But why not? His question was genuine, puzzled. Let's see. She put a ringed finger to her chin in an exaggerated form of contemplation. Because maybe if I explain the situation you'd think less of me. Tracy, lots of people have kids in trouble. Her sarcasm bothered him. It seemed a knife abrading his arm. I'd think less of you, he echoed. Huh? That's right, how could you possibly think less of? Stop it. God damn it. Stop it now. Stop it. He stood up. She said quietly, and you stop with the liberal white pity. Just in time, but in time, always. Charlie was just in time. He prevented himself from the slap across her face. He could practically feel tingling throughout his hand. She turned from him with disdain, and so he did not apologize. Disdain did not become her, there was an element of theatricality to it, he felt. There had been a chaplain. God, what a nice guy he was, simple. God weeps with us, he had said, and you couldn't get mad at him for that. After the night at Key San, they'd brought in another chaplain, a phony. Theatrical. Jesus is your friend, the new chaplain would say, with silly pontification, as though he were dispensing Jesus pills that only he was in charge of. Once he had gone to the hospital, and they had asked him to come back to attend a group. It was helpful, they suggested, to hear what others had to say. But it had included, it made Charlie's head heavy to picture it. The circle of folding chairs, the younger ones in their fatigues, and it was mostly the younger ones who were there. They told of going into Iraqi towns, they told of not sleeping, they told of drinking too much, and Charlie could not stand them. Some were still young enough to have pimples. He had given orders to kids this young, and they made him sick to see. That horrified him, that he loathed these people. Being there with them exacerbated the very thing he thought he might die from. Because he could tell, and he had feared this, that the fellow running the group did not really know what to do. Because there was nothing to do. Talk about it? Sure thing. Take a cigarette break, talk about it more. At the third meeting he left when they broke for cigarettes, and then he was truly frightened. Robin he met through her ad on the internet. He drove the 2 hours from Carlisle to Peoria, and first greeted her in the lobby of the town's oldest hotel. The hotel had recently been refurbished, and the lobby sparkled with glass and waterfalls. The elevators pinged politely off to the right as he and Robin sat in the downstairs bar. They talked quietly, and he was, oh God Almighty, he was the closest thing to happy he had been for years. A light-skinned black woman with green eyes, she gave off a sense of quiet self-assuredness. The lamincy of this lightly worn authority made him right away love the space between her two front teeth, the cold pencil line above her eyelashes, how she'd listen and nod and say, that's right. She was 40 years old, and she had 2 daughters who stayed with their grandmother when Robin could not be with them. He had taken a room on the top floor with a view of the river, and he noticed she discreetly kept an eye on her time, told him when he had gone over, added an hour, but she was smooth and calm and polite, and this quality remained even beneath the sweet outbursts of her sexuality, which, from the start, he had never felt to be faked, and so he was always able to feel okay. It was something. Why are you doing this? He asked. They must all wonder, he added. Some do, most don't. For money, she said, sitting up. Shrugging slightly. That simple. The bumps of her spine lined up perfectly beneath her skin, and took his breath away. It was her suggestion a few months later that they meet at the motel, a half hour from Peoria, that the money saved from not being in the fancy hotel could be used for them to see each other more. Only he couldn't see her more than he already was, he couldn't get away. So they had continued at the motel and he gave her the extra money, and then they fell in love. He had loved her, really, from the start, and she said she had fallen in love with him too, and told him her name was Tracy. While she sat fully clothed, right in that chair. And that was how it had been for 7 months now, desperately in love. Charlie did not like desperate. Tracy was standing in the bathroom snapping tissues. From the slit in the wall, from where Charlie sat on the bed, he could see her yanking the stiff little skirts of white. The motel made sure you could not steal a box of them. She wiped her face, then washed it with a face cloth, reapplied lipstick, and returned to the room. His relief returned as well. It had never gone far. This was going to be over, and that was all that mattered. And then Tracy, boy, how people could surprise you, said something insanely funny. She said, I thought you had the character to help me out. He asked her to repeat it, and she did, looking slightly wary. He sat down on the bed and laughed and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, and soon he was able to stop. I miss it, he said, finally, wiping his sleeve across his face. She looked at him now with a faint sense of irritation. Character, he added. I miss it. Those days seemed like ancient times, back when character was thought to mean everything, as though character were the altar before which all decency bowed. That science now showed genetics to be determinative. Just threw all that character stuff right over the waterfall. That anxiety was wired, or became wired after events of trauma, that one was not strong or weak, only made a certain way. Yes, he missed character. The nobility of it? Why, it was like being forced to give up religion once you'd been confronted with its base and primitive aspects, like having to view the Catholic Church with its nest of pedophilia and endless cover UPS and popes that worked with Hitler or Mussolini. Charlie was not Catholic, and the few Catholics he knew did continue to go to Mass, but he could not see how, faced as they were with the chipping away of the brilliant facade, of course, the Church was failing. But so was the Protestant concept of hard work and decency and character. Character? Who ever used that word anymore? Tracy did. Tracy used that word. He looked over at her. The eyes still smudged black with that mascara. Hey, kid, he said. Hey, Tracy, and opened his arms to her. Quietly she said, my name isn't Tracy. After a moment she added, and that license is fake. Just so you know. The whole thing is fake. She leaned forward and whispered, fake. A sound came from him. It was not unusual, he often made sounds without planning to. It happened sometimes in public, and it scared people. In a library? Once, a young person had looked at him, and Charlie understood that he had made a noise, a growl. Marilyn. Idiot woman, whispered to the boy, he was in the war. And the kid didn't know what Marilyn meant. Many young people did not know the name of the war he had served in. Was it because it was a conflict instead of a war? Was it because the country in its shame had pushed this war behind it like a child who in public was still being obstreperous, embarrassing. Or was it just the way that history went? He did not know. But when he heard a young person with those perfect teeth they all had now say, "Wait, what was that? I'm sorry," followed by the self-deprecating grimace that was utterly false in its apology, trying to gauge how old Charlie was. "Sorry, was that in the first Iraq?" Then Charlie wanted to cry, he wanted to bawl, he wanted to bellow. "We did that, and for what, for what, for what?" He had never rid himself of an abiding dislike for all Asians and women who looked at him with fear. "Here's an idea." Charlie stood up. "Let's go." She hoisted her bag over her shoulder and waited. She did not look at him with fear. She did not look at him at all. The hangers in the closet twanged against one another. As he got his coat, metal hangers whose tops wrapped completely around the pole so they could not be stolen. "All set?" he asked in a cheerful voice, slipping on his coat, and he stood back to let her go through the door. Before him, there was the same familiar oddness of watching himself. The bewilderment of how much he loved her, yet that was more knowledge now than feeling, when not on any conceivable level did it make sense, except for the only one that mattered. She had saved him, given him the space within which he could breathe. Or he had, through her, given this to himself. Because watching her he saw nothing, not one thing, that could have caused him to feel as he did, still desiring her. He found the sight of her puzzling. But it was over. Praise God, there was still that open space of relief. "Follow me in your car," he said. He headed back toward the center of this town about which he knew almost nothing except for his forays to this motel. He knew the department store on Main Street, and the Victorian-looking bed and breakfast that always had a vacancy sign out front, yet always looked welcoming, wearing its fresh color of pale blue like a shy child who had kindness within. He did not know where a branch of his bank might be, but he drove as though it would appear, only glancing once in the rear-view mirror to see her following him. She was biting on her lip, a gesture so familiar to him he knew not to look in the mirror again. He drove with the fully set sun off to his right, and he noted once more that he felt okay. Passing an old church, he thought that if she had not been following, he might have pulled over just to look at it from the road. He had sometimes felt a need to pray. This need was as abhorrent to him as was the sight of his wife. He had been brought up in a Methodist church that had done nothing for him at all, except that he associated the experience with car sickness. He had attended some services at the Congregational Church with Marilyn because she wanted to, but that experience of duty had attenuated as soon as the children reached early adolescence. He could not stand it, he told her, and she did not argue with him. They simply stopped going. And no one in the church pursued them, except for the baptism of his grandchildren, and the funeral of Patty Nicely's husband. Charlie had not been in a church for years. But these days, sometimes, he just wanted to go into a church and pray. He wanted to fall on his knees, and what would he pray for? Forgiveness. There was nothing else to pray for, not if you were Charlie Macaulay. Charles Macaulay did not have the luxury, the foolery, to pray for health for his children or the ability to better love his wife. No, Charlie Macaulay could only pray, beg on his knees, "Dear God, forgive me if you can stand to." But how sickening It made him sick. Off to the right, past one more traffic light, he saw the sign for a branch of his bank. Pulling into the parking lot, he saw that the bank was still open and experienced a sense of strange accomplishment. He watched as she pulled in behind him. He signaled with one hand that she should stay where she was, and she nodded once. In about 10 minutes he carried out 2 envelopes of cash. They had the bulky softness of flesh and handed them to her through her partly open driver's side window. She opened the window more, as though she were about to thank him, but he shook his head to stop her. "If I hear from you again, I'll track you down and kill you myself," he said calmly. "Whether your name is Tracy or Lacey or Shitty or Pretty. Get it? Because you will need more." She started her car and drove away. Now the shaking began, first his hands, then his arms, and then his thighs. He had stolen from Marilyn, and wasn't that different? It seemed to him that that was different from anything else he had done. He was no longer earning money, nor was she. It really shook him up. He had stolen money from his wife. He sat in his car until he felt he could drive. Only the faintest afterglow was in the sky now. It was a dangerous time, because it was essentially dark, not even dusk anymore. Quickly, quietly, night had descended. And yet it was not nighttime. There were hours before one could sleep. His pills at best gave him 5 hours of sleep. The bed and breakfast was a larger house than it appeared to be from the street. He parked in the lot behind it and walked back around. The air was crisp against his face like the witch hazel aftershave he'd used many years ago, and he went up the front steps, which slightly creaked, and that sound slightly pleased him. His instinct told him that this was a good place to be when the real blow arrived. He could be safe here. It could allow a man like him. In fact, the woman who answered the door was as old as he was, perhaps older, a tiny prim woman with good skin. Immediately he thought, "She'll be afraid of me." But she did not seem to be. She looked him in the eye, asked if a room without a television would be all right. If he wanted to watch television, he could watch it here in the living room. The other guests seemed to have already turned in. At first he told her no, he did not need a television, but when he saw his room, he understood that he could not sit in there and wait, and so he came back into the hall. And she said, "Of course," and gave him the remote, and said, "Do you mind if I join you once I'm done in the kitchen?" He said he wouldn't mind. "I don't care what we watch," she added. In a distant way he understood that she had her own echoes of pain at their age. He supposed, who did not? Then he supposed that many did not. It occurred to him often that many did not have echoes of pain from the silent noises he carried in his head. He sat on the couch and heard her in the kitchen. He crossed his arms, and watched a British comedy because British comedies were ridiculous, so removed from anything real safe, those British comedies, the accents, the clackety teacups. And so he waited. It would come. The wave upon wave of raw pain after a blow like this. Oh, yes, it would come. Quietly, the proprietress slipped into the room. From the edge of his eye he saw that she took the big chair in the corner. "Oh, perfect," she murmured, he assumed, meaning the choice of show. He wanted to ask her, "If you made your name up and chose it to be Tracy, what do you think your real name would be?" And so it was coming closer, Yes sirree Bob. He knew what it was. He had been there before, and then it would be over. And yet, it was taking longer than he thought it would. You never get used to pain, no matter what anyone says about it. But now, for the first time, it occurred to him. Could it really be the first time this had occurred to him, that there was something far more frightening? People who no longer felt pain at all. He had seen it in other men, the blankness behind the eyes, the lack that then defined them. So Charlie, a tiny bit, sat up straighter, and he stared pretty hard at that television set. He waited, hope like a crocus bulb inside him now. He waited and he hoped, he practically prayed. Oh sweet Jesus, let it come. Dear God. Please, could you please let it come?